Hello, and welcome to Part 7 of the Praxist Table Talks analysis of Julius Evola's Revolt against the Modern World. This episode is the culmination of the first half of the book. The way he wrote this book was essentially the first half was the sort of doctrine of tradition, capital T tradition, and the latter half is sort of a historiography of capital T tradition as it existed in traditional societies and manifestations around the globe. So, this is the we've read every chapter except for the last three, or we've gone through every chapter except for the last three in the first half of the book outlining the doctrine of tradition. And so this episode in particular is going to deal with essentially what is the conclusion of his doctrine. So he goes over a few loose ends. He ties up a few loose ends, if you will, with space, time, and the earth. And with we begin from chapter 19 and we go to chapter 21. And so he begins with space, time, and the earth. Then he goes on to chapter 20 with man and woman, and then he goes into his conclusion of the first half of the book in the chapter called The Decline of Superior Races. And the chapter title itself is a little bit provocative, but we will get to what he actually means when we get to it. But before we start, my name is Vincent. I am the founder of Praxia, and I have with me a member of our leadership council. Cody, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Should we just be introducing each other as the host and co-host at this point?
Essentially, that's what we are, right? Because we used to have a few more members come on the podcast, but no longer. So, yeah, essentially, yeah, host, co-host. That's what we are. But I'm glad to hear that you're doing well. What was your first impression of this section of the readings?
Well, this definitely seems like a more disparate collection of chapters, whereas the sections that we cordoned off previously had flown into each other quite well, whereas this one kind of jumps around a bit chaotically, and that's, like you said, more or less tying up the loose ends. The first half of Time, Space, the Earth is very concept-heavy, and listeners might have a hard time understanding what Evola's getting at exactly, especially if it's your first time reading the book or dealing with concepts like this. So it's definitely an imperative to read and reread that chapter a few times over to really get the separation between terms that Evola is trying to kind of cement in people's minds. And then the Man and Woman chapter seemed fairly prophetic, even though Evola was kind of just addressing the points that he was seeing in real time in his own life, but still had no idea the weight on which his words would carry into the future, seeing as the decline that has happened even after his life in such a short time, just 50 years since his death?
Yeah, just
and
about.
Things have gone so much further than anything he might have seen, and how, like I said, weighted his words are for that chapter. And then the last chapter is more or less a summary of the previous 20 chapters, all in culmination, as well as the addition to why Evola sees things in this declining format, the necessary revolt against the modern world as we need to have it because of a issue of quantitative reasoning and the people that have come to the helm of society nowadays versus what would be in a traditional society, and the qualitative essence of people in positions of power then.
Not even just positions of power, but positions in general, like people and their actual orientation, so it has what I'm saying is the essential and fundamental point of his Man and Woman hits, I don't think, just at the idea of the hierarchy, but of the principle of every man and every woman. And so I think that's going to be an interesting chapter to get into, especially because this would be so looked down upon or done away with when in modern times, especially by philosophers who, like you said, level everything to that interchangeable and egalitarian level, or lower everything to that interchangeable and egalitarian level. and sort of forget the qualitative nature of the being, which he is kind of describing throughout this book. But it culminates in man and woman because those concepts touch so close to what we understand. They touch so close to home because they are concepts we have to live with throughout our lives. They are immediate to us, and so his description of them, I think, is, like you said, it is very prophetic, and it, I think, does a very good job at explaining the essence of the spiritual transcendence of the two sexes. And then with the decline of superior races, it's I think this is a nice, like I said, it's a nice culmination, a nice conclusion to the book, or the first part of the book. And yeah, it was a very good read. And so what he's talking about when he says superior races, he talks about the decline of what is essentially, he will outline later on, but it's essentially the golden race, the Greek golden race, the Hindu Satya Yuga, the people who enjoyed that spiritual time, and the inevitable decay of these people, and the further materializations and the not resurgence, but the emergence of the carnal principle within the being, and the conditioning of the being to physical reality and his instincts, rather than his conscious or sentient mind that is connected to that more divine mode of being. So I think we can just get into space, time, and the Earth. What do you think? Would you say that that's a good place to start?
Absolutely.
All right, so when it comes to space, time, and the Earth, this is the first chapter that we're going to be covering today. It basically, Evola has separated this chapter into essentially three categories, or three different subtopics. And the first one is obviously, the first one is time. The second one is essentially space and the way in which space and the Earth and the physical realities correspond with higher metaphysical realities. And then the last part of this chapter, the last third of this chapter, is essentially looking at the various mythological interpretations of how traditional man experienced time. So he looks at like the Aztec tradition, for example, or the Greek tradition, or the way in which the Roman traditions adhered to this view of time and space and the Earth and physical reality in general, or the way we experience the temporal mode, the way in which the traditional societies interpreted this and participated within this, and used these to essentially reach the higher, more metaphysical reality. And so we have to remember with Evola, essentially everything is ordered by metaphysics. There is nothing that is ordered from the physical degree upwards, except as we'll get into, a sort of spontaneous alignment, but even that is metaphysically influenced. So there's no phenomenon that occurs in physical reality that doesn't have some type of metaphysical significance. And so what we would consider as space, or which is essentially the area in which an area in which certain bodies exist, in which manifestations actually appear, and how we consider time as the essential duration of how long things occur, and the Earth, essentially the physical reality that we can see and interact with. All of these have metaphysical implications to them, and originate from a prior metaphysical principle. And so these things do not act on their own. They are put into motion and certainly react, but not necessarily act. And so that's the principle that he gets into with space, time, and the Earth. So he starts off by saying, let's see here. I have previously pointed out that the difference between traditional and modern man is not simply a matter of mentality and type of civilization. Rather, the difference concerns the experiential possibilities available to each, and the way in which the world of nature is experienced according to the categories of perception and the fundamental relationship between the I and the not I. So, what he's essentially saying here is that the traditional man participates in higher modes of being by essentially removing the distinguishability between the different beings. It was like I was saying in one of the previous episodes. I can't remember which one, but essentially humans have a tendency to categorize and distinguish certain beings from one another, and the traditional man was able to decategorize and essentially see the world for what it is, and each part within it having its specific place and specific function and acting accordingly to that. And so, by way of doing this, whether it be through the the heroic principle, the active principle, or the contemplative principle, man was able to use his modality to communicate with this higher mode of everything, this indistinguishable essence that is all things, rather than independent beings within it. So that's the relationship between the I and the not I, the self and the everything else except the self, or outside of the self. So he says, for traditional man, space, time, and causality had a very different character than they have in the experience of modern man. The mistake of epistemology from Kant on, is to assume that these fundamental forms of human experience have always remained the same, especially those with which we are most familiar in recent times. So, again, the way in which we experience mundane reality by social interactions, or interactions with physical objects, or what we see through our eyes or perceive through our senses, essentially is only symbolical, according to Evola. Whereas from Kant on, and I would say even from a bit earlier onwards, these were considered the epitome of reality itself. You could go beyond. You could go no further beyond this, and this is actually a principle that you could find in the Enlightenment period. I was having a conversation actually on the YouTube channel with a guy who was talking about the various epistemologies, or the epistemological systems, and the way in which the term metaphysics itself is defined differently. And essentially, for Evola and the traditionalists, everything is connected and has a certain format to it, a certain formula to it that formats as it manifests. And for the Enlightenment thinkers, there is no format to reality. There is no metaphysical absolute. There is simply metaphysical relatives which interact with one another. And so there is no essential truth or quintessential truth or divine reality. There is simply reality in which these various activities occur. So already we're seeing a lowering of what Evola considered to be traditional man's interpretation of space and time, even within that period itself. And then, of course, onwards we get, what we have today, with the consideration of mundane reality being the highest consideration itself. And so he says, on the contrary, even in this aspect, it is possible to notice a deep transformation that reflects the general involutive process at work in history. With this said, I will limit myself to discussing the difference in the perception of space and time. So he says, so he goes on to characterize time in the same way that I've kind of outlined in this episode. He says time is perceived as the simple, irreversible order of consecutive events. Its parts are mutually homogeneous and can therefore be measured in a quantitative fashion. Moreover, a distinction is made between before and after in reference to a totally relative point in time. But whether an event is past or future, whether it takes place in one time or another, or in one or another point in time, it does not confer upon it any special quality. It merely makes it a datable event, that's all. In other words, there is some kind of reciprocal indifference between time and its contents. The temporality of these contents simply means that they are carried along by a continuous current that never inverts its course, and in which every moment, while being different from all others, is also equal to all others. So that's how he characterizes the modern interpretation of time. And then he goes on to say that the traditional experience of time was very different. Time was not regarded quantitatively, but rather qualitatively, not as a series, but as a rhythm. It didn't flow uniformly and indefinitely, but was broken down into cycles and periods in which every moment had its own meaning and specific value in relation to all others, as well as a lively individuality and functionality. So what he's saying here is that essentially you have... he goes on to give this footnote as well, which is... let's see, he says, the durations of traditional time may be compared to numbers that in turn are regarded as the enumerations of lower unities, or as sums capable of serving as units for the composition of higher numbers. Continuity is given to them by the mental operation that synthesizes these elements. And so what he's basically saying is that time, in a sense, is cyclical. This is the first place in which he explicitly introduces the concept of cyclical time, which is that the yugas and in Hinduism, it is the ages that you can find, like the gold, silver, bronze, and iron in Greek mythology. I believe it's there in Norse mythology as well, culminating with the age of the wolf. and all of these different things. This is where cyclical time comes into play. And so what he's basically saying is that time is essentially characterized by an enclosure of certain temporal manifestations of metaphysical qualities that occur in a sort of rhythm, one after the other, but that might not share all of the same manifestations or durations, but have the same quality about them. So, for example, let's say traditional measurement of time, it might take 1 year to have a certain quality bestowed upon that period of time, but it doesn't matter that it took a year long, because the quality is there to be appreciated and assumed, not necessarily the quantitative measure is not necessarily the focus here. It is the quality that is left by the event. And then this year might replicate itself into a second year, and then the second year might, in a sense, occur with the same theme, the same central theme, but it would have a different manifestation to it. It would have a different aesthetic, or be manifested in a different way, but it would have the same essence within it. And then these 2 years would be considered together as one unit that essentially represents a complete cycle. This is just an example. And then this cycle would repeat again and again and again. So you have these larger cycles that incorporate lesser cycles within them. It's almost like a spiraling outwards of sorts. And so that's what he's getting at here with traditional time. Do you have anything to add before I kind of go
on? Quite a few things, in fact.
Go ahead.
So he does mention that he alluded to this in the foreword, and he calls back to that in his statement of time as a cyclical process. I do have to disagree with Evola a bit, because I think that it's not just one or the other. I think there is a cyclical pattern to reality, but it is also a linear movement that, at least that we can perceive. And it harkens back to a quote by Mark Twain, where he goes, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme." And I think that's essentially what Evola is getting at here, but in less words. So there is the march forward in time that, is ever present and ever moving, and things will never be again, or come to be that never was before. And that's something that I think Evola doesn't want to address in certain ways, because there's the aspect of the traditional form of being that contests with that modern form of perceiving time that is at odds with each other. But they exist simultaneous to each other, but one takes precedent depending on what age you're in that dichotomy, whether it's modernity or whether it's tradition. And so when we're in modernity, everything is relegated to a point on the line, whereas when you're in tradition, everything is relegated to phases of repetition, in a way, or phases of rhyme and rhythm, like what Evola was stating there, and what we're going to get into soon with the different numbers that are associated with these ages. And that's where I kind of deviate from where Evola was trying to assert here, but it's only a small sort of deviation in that regard. Otherwise, I don't think I have anything else to add that's not getting ahead of myself.
Yeah. I get what you're saying too, because I had the same type of disagreement, because it's hard for me to see exactly how this version of time exists without a complete... I can't see how this would exist with a complete negation. Okay, my bad. All right, let me restart. It's hard to see how this interpretation of time would exist without a complete negation of the experiences that we have of time ourselves. Like what you were saying with time being this ever continuing thing, there is a certain point, like, you can't go backwards in time. You can't revisit events that occurred in the past.
Well, that's something that Evola also points at too, with modern conceptions in physics on the mathematical boundaries of time being expressed as a dimension in space. And that's something that he kind of laments in this chapter here, where I don't know why he does. Maybe that's just him rejecting the notion of further quantifying and diluting the concept of time, but I don't think it's doing that necessarily. It's understanding more how we are able to perceive time in our material state and how that can be manipulated in certain ways. But that's not necessarily negating anything that he's saying that is also true. So there's a bit of I guess, an agitation there in Evola's contest to the natural physics of the universe versus the spiritual essential truths that kind of transcend the universe.
Yeah, and this leads me into the idea of cyclical time on repeat, connected by a almost like, think of like a cassette tape where one kind of feeds into the other. I would consider that the timeline that Evola is trying to describe here, because what he's saying is that time doesn't have a definitive beginning or a definitive end, but what it has is these reoccurring, not events, but reoccurring themes that have metaphysical significances to them that need to occur if reality is to continue on a proper path, or if all things are to be upheld as they are, or as they are supposed to be. He says that instead of an indefinite chronological sequence, the traditional world knew a hierarchy based on analogical correspondences between great and small cycles, and the result was a sort of reduction of the temporal manifold to the supertemporal unity. Since the small cycle reproduced analogically the great cycle, this created the possibility of participation in even greater orders and in durations increasingly free from all residues or matter of contingency until what was reached was some kind of space-time continuum. And that was kind of what you were getting at with the with his interpretation of time. The way that I think this is best characterized is that, because he goes on to equate this with the idea that for a day, 1 year for a man is 1 day for a god, and then 1 year for that lesser god might be 1 day for one greater god, until you get to this principle which is outside of time itself and does not experience time, which is essentially the master of time. And so he says, I can't remember where it is. He says that
the third footnote on page 144, I think you were getting at, where he is expressing that in the days and nights of Brahmana and the laws of Manu.
Yes, that's the one. He says that this idea is reflected in the Hindu view, according to which a year on Earth corresponds to a day for some lesser gods, while a year for these gods' lives corresponds to a day for gods occupying a higher hierarchical level, until we reach the days and nights of Brahman, which expresses the cyclical unfolding of the cosmic manifestation. And so he says, in the same text, it is written that these cycles are repeated by the Supreme Lord as if he were playing. And so this expresses the irrelevance and the anti-historicity of the repetition in comparison to the immutable and eternal element that's manifested within it. And so this is what I think he was getting at. I'm not so sure he was rejecting outright the notion that time is experiential. I don't think he was rejecting the notion of historicity itself. What I think he's doing is trying to emphasize that the traditional society needs to be formatted on these principles that are essentially timeless, and manifest these principles according to certain times that they correspond to in the year. So, for example, that's why we have like the winter solstice holidays when we do that, because it signifies a death and rebirth of the year. But the winter solstice holiday also, it signifies the brand new year. And so you have a lot of these new year traditions coming out around this time, because it signifies a revitalization of the year and of the solar cycle. And that's just one example, but that can only occur during the winter solstice. And you have this whole he even mentions the Catholic liturgical year, in a sense, that he says is spangled with religious festivities and with days marked by sacred events. And he says that in this liturgical year we can find an echo of the ancient view of time that was measured by a ritual, transfigured by a symbol, and shaped into the image of a sacred history. And so his anti-historicity is the sort of emphasis on that mythological aspect of history where you are sort of getting into meta history rather than actual history, and why these myths and events have so much impact to them. And essentially, that's what I think his focus is. I don't think it's necessarily a rejection of it, but an emphasis on the opposite aspect that has had a loss, or that has had a reduction in its emphasis as time goes on. And I don't know.
I don't think.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, I wasn't trying to get at that he was contesting the literal experience of time and trying to redefine that in terms of how the traditional man literally experienced it. But I think there is a bit of a rejection just because it is the modern experience of time in these purely quantitative terms as, dating events in historical matters rather than also experiencing the essence of the cycles that we ought to be going through as well. And that's a point that I know he's pointing out in the decline of our civilizations now through this Kali Yuga, Age of the Wolf, so on and so forth, that is that we're in. That's not to say that it can't also be a literal application of things, because as we've stated, there's more truth in the mythology than there is in the historicity of so many of these stories, and so the repetition of these heroes and morals and so on is that expression of cycles that literally happen throughout time, rhyming, as it were, going back to the Mark Twain quote, that are a sort of, a rebirth in a way, a reincarnation, as it were, of things that have already been tried but haven't been succeeded in. And it's sort of this, it's hard to put it into words at the moment, but this approximation going to an ultimate end. And maybe it's just that downward spiral of involution in a ways, because it's things being repeated to the point of insanity until it all kind of peters out, and then something new is born entirely into a new age altogether, which is more or less where we're headed in all the dark ages that all these traditional civilizations foresaw.
Yeah, and I think that what he's getting at also is he's trying to say that time essentially has this element to it that is like a what are those things called? Those types of padlocks, the combination locks. Essentially, time is like a combination lock where you have to align all of these different essentially combinations that occur in a greater or lesser length in relation to each other, but have the same quality about them to essentially open the lock. The inner like the inner circle of the lock is the smallest circle, that is surrounded by the middle circle that is surrounded by the outer circle. And so, you have to spin the lock one way to get the inner circle to align, and then you have to spin it to the other direction for a longer period of time or a shorter period of time to get it to essentially align. And then, you have to do that a third time, and then the lock unlocks. That's essentially what he's talking about with time. You have to go through certain events that represent certain metaphysical principles in 1 year, and then you might have to go through 5 years of those 1 years so that the 5-year cycle can line up with that same essential format and formula. And then you have to do that again for, let's say, 15 years. And so that 15-year span lines up with that same essential formula. And this keeps going on and on until the durations get so long that you are essentially stepping out of time, because these cycles are being looked down upon by a being which is almost too big to be encapsulated by such a cycle, or who is destined to something that is greater than the cycle entails itself. And that's what I think he means by this sort of supreme lord repeating these cycles as if he were playing. And in a sense, he is this supreme lord is the expression of the principle that dictates the time. It's the cycles of time itself. You know what I'm saying? So I feel like it's a lot more nuanced.
I think that's what he's getting at with the quote from Emperor Julian. There is in the heavens a great multitude of gods who have been recognized as such by those who survey the by those who survey the great multitude of gods who have been recognized as such by those.
No, by those who survey the heavens,
sorry.
not casually, nor like cattle. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm looking at my screen at a odd angle.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Yeah. There is in the heavens a great multitude of gods who have been recognized as such by those who survey the heavens not casually, nor like cattle. Therefore, we can assume that the position of the... Oh, that's... Okay, he's going on. Anyways.
He's ending quote there at
quote.
cattle. And then we can use the sun in the course of a year as a center at the beginning of an organic system, which is an extension of what he's getting at here and what we just, took 20 minutes to explain.
Yeah, exactly. And so the idea here is that he goes on to say that he says the fact that stars, stellar periods, and given points in the course of the sun were traditionally utilized to determine the units of rhythm hardly lends support to these so-called naturalistic interpretations of time. So he's saying that the way that you can measure time based on, like, let's say, celestial events, or the pattern of the stars, or by examining the night sky, or by the position of the sun in relation to the moon, or these different solar cycles, he's saying that he's saying that because you can measure these things does not mean that they merely are this way because of time. He is saying that time is this way because of these positionings, which are determined metaphysically. So it's essentially an outwards in look rather than an inwards outlook. And I think that's what the ultimate point he's trying to make is that these are metaphysically determined, and you can read these as if they were symbols of higher realities, but they are not realities themselves. They are only symbols. And that kind of gets back to what we were talking about in our atheist episode, where physical reality is nothing but a symbol of certain metaphysical principles themselves. And I actually wrote a whole essay on this that was more or less impromptu, but it was essentially about the idea of symbolic reality and the idea or the essential goal of the esotericist is to understand symbology, right? And all esotericism essentially amounts to symbology. And that was the thesis for the episode. And I said, picture the symbol of a cross painted on a canvas. The cross itself doesn't express anything unless there is something qualitatively prior or fundamentally superior for it to express. Most universally, the cross symbol has represented the union between the vertical and horizontal planes, which we'll actually get into later on in this chapter. Or in other words, metaphysical reality and physical reality, or heaven and earth. But the idea of the cross, right? The cross signifies something that exists prior to it for it to signify. And it is a symbol within temporal reality that signifies metaphysical reality or physical reality itself. So it is essentially, it symbolizes the intersection between metaphysical reality and physical reality, but it exists itself within physical reality. So in a sense, what Evola is saying with time here is that these cycles symbolize these greater cycles, but exist within these greater cycles. So you would have a year that symbolizes, like I said, a 5-year span, or the qualities that need to occur, or that need to be manifested within the 5-year span, but it would do it only in 1 year. And because it does it in 1 year and repeats itself over the course of 5 years, that means that it marks a complete cycle. And so you can look at one cycle and analyze it and see the same elements, or you can look at one small cycle and analyze it and see within it the same elements that you can essentially expand outwards on, and look at these larger cycles of these smaller durations and find the same elements within these larger cycles. That's essentially what he's getting at with cyclical time. And that, I don't think, necessarily contradicts the idea of the modern experience of time. What I think it does is it is essentially antithetical to the modern interpretation of that experience. We are experiencing it linearly, whereas he's saying that what we experience linearly only plays into a wider cycle that we can't see the horizon of because we are so close down to the lowest level of it. That's what I think he's trying to get at.
That makes a lot of sense.
And so he says later, he goes on to mention, so one of his major theses for this chapter is that he said basically the numerology that you can find, for example, in the signs of the zodiac, or in the calendar system, or things like that. These numbers had a sacred character to them. They weren't sacred because they denoted something. They were sacred because they were already denotations of something that was prior to their existence. So they weren't created and then they were sacred. They were sacred because something else was created that they symbolized, much like the cross and much like these interpretations of time. And so he says, let's see. He goes on to talk about the signs of the zodiac because 12 is this essential number that you can find basically anywhere in any tradition that characterizes a important aspect of that tradition. He goes on, this footnote that he has right here, that he details it in, it goes into all of the different examples of it. And some, just to name a few, he says that he says the number 12 characterizing the signs of the zodiac, which corresponded to the Hindu Aditya, appears in the number of the chapters of the laws of Manu, in the 12 great Namshan, in the circular council of the Dalai Lama, in the 12 disciples of Lao Tzu, originally 2, who in turn initiated another 10, in the number of the priests of several Roman collegia, in the number of the ancilia established by Numa in return for the sign of the heavenly protection he received. 12 is also the number of virtues that gave to, or the number of vultures that gave to Romulus rather than Remus the right to give his name to the city. 12 were also the lectorians instituted by Romulus, and in the altars dedicated to Janus, in the 12 disciples of Christ, and in the 12 gates of the heavenly Jerusalem, in the 12 great Hellenic and Roman deities. And he goes on like this. It's only like halfway through the paragraph, but what he's going on to explain here is this idea of 12 that reoccurs all the way throughout in many traditions. This number 12 appears as a very, very significant number, and so this is essentially his measurement to understand what he calls a quote-unquote solar fulfillment. He says that these moments of the sun's position in the sky, the number 12 is repeatedly found as one of the most apt rhythms to express anything that may have had the meaning of a solar fulfillment. And so that was one of the things that I found as very interesting, because it's not very much like you see the commonalities in different traditions when you examine the perennial philosophy itself, but such a reoccurrence. And you can even see it in modern times with the 12 months of the year, that has a significance, I think, that dates back to this original 12 as well. So that was just an interesting tidbit that I stumbled upon while reading this.
And it's not just that, it's the number 7 he refers to in the same footnote as well, being rhythms of development for any number of fulfillments, either cosmic, spiritual, metaphorical, or so on. And they have so many applications throughout, the historical world as well, whether that be days Buddha spent under the Bodhi tree, the 7 cycles of the days of each doctrine, according to Buddhist traditions, the biblical creation myth, where the 7 days God took and on the 7th he rested, and so many more going throughout it all. And you can see this even in the mathematical expression of natural phenomenon with 12 and 7, and in a few other numbers like 3, 6, and 9, which Tesla was obsessed with. And we were talking off call about maybe dedicating an episode to exploring the more esoteric natures of great men like Tesla. Newton is definitely another one too that had some insights into the spiritual essence of things that went beyond his contributions to the sciences. And it was investigations in things like this, in the numerology and sacred geometry of things, as well as the mathematical patterns that persist not just in the natural world, but in the supernatural world as well, that seem to repeat and rhyme, just as we've said before, kind of signifying that there is a holistic nature to these things. 12, again, going as the disciples that followed Jesus throughout his ascension up into the cross, and then 7 also signifying the number of perfection that is denoted in the Bible, the 7 colors on the rainbow and so forth, and 6 being the number that delineates imperfection and what people call the mark of the beast, as it were. But that's kind of just reinforcing the point that Evola's making here.
And the number 7 can also be seen in like the days of the week. So in the same way that the number 12 corresponds to the months of the year, 7 corresponds to the days of the week, which is also very interesting.
Yeah.
It's like the last residues of these numbers that were in traditional society very, very important. And
although I am one of the people that get kind of autistic about the topic of making 13 months instead of 12 because it just aligns better mathematically, and then having, the one off day of the year dedicated to a singular month that has that 13th day. But then that gets into, leap years and everything else that is a whole conundrum in and of itself. That's just an aside.
Wasn't there something about, I can't remember if it was a traditional society or something like that. One of these had a 360-day year with a 5-year gap, or a 5-day gap in between each year. And they used that 5 days to signify the birth of the new year. Kind of like a winter solstice tradition. I just can't remember exactly which one it was. But I always thought that would be interesting. It would probably line up more, too. So, anyways, he goes on to say that He goes on to say that the same idea occurs. Well, actually, let's end up. Let's finish up with time first. Actually, he says he wants to make sure that he emphasizes that this is not fatalism. So basically, the fact that these cycles reoccur each time that a cycle is closed. So, you close one cycle and another one opens up and has the same element. Or the fact that these hierarchically reoccur or reflect the same elements of a cycle within a cycle. This isn't fatalism, because what is required for this is a sort of bottom-up alignment of the physical principle with the metaphysical preordainment. So, essentially, metaphysics can influence physics only insofar as the trajectory is concerned, right? It can set the trajectory, but the relative element associated with the physical reality essentially has the capability to pull away from that trajectory or depart in this or that direction. And that's what I was essentially getting at with the idea of spontaneous, or the element of propriety and spontaneous alignment with that. And Evola's kind of getting at that here. Basically, if the physical or temporal elements do not spontaneously align or stay on the same trajectory, then these cycles are not fulfilled, and the quality of the greater hierarchy is diminished from within because of this mini cycle not being met, which in turn means that the greater cycle is not met, which means that as time goes on, the greater cycles are not met all the way up, and it unfolds outwards until there is no time. And I almost wonder if that's why he wanted to sort of emphasize this, because this kind of gets into the idea of the Kali Yuga, but it also gets into idea of a self-destructive, almost, I don't want to say fatalist because it's not, but a sort of inevitable destruction of time itself and a necessary rebirth of time as it goes on into the next cycle. And so maybe he's basically saying that this is how time will unravel and the Kali Yuga will end and the next one will begin, is because time will become so quantitative and the qualitative element will no longer be found. That is when the entire cycle ends and the new cycle begins. I don't know if that's what he's trying to say here, but that was kind of my
actually, he does say explicitly that it's not fatalism, rather an expression of traditional man's constant intent to prolong and integrate his own strength with a non-human strength by discovering the times in which two rhythms, the human and the supernatural, by virtue of a law of syntony, of a concordant action and certain correspondence between the physical and metaphysical dimensions, are liable to become one thing and thus cause invisible powers to act. Kind of paraphrasing him for the most part there. And that's what he's getting at on a higher symbolical and sacral cycle that's built into the structure of the universe that, we can interact with in a way, but we can't conquer as we'd want to. So it's a bit of like a us trying to act as gods and influence the essential nature of reality in a way for our own temporal desires, but ultimately failing and things kind of resetting themselves and going back to base level, and then it all kind of going up again. It's like a ramping up to an inevitable conclusion, and then starting from scratch because, like we said, it's that repetition of things kind of devolving downward until it rebirths right from the very top, all the way anew instead of the Kali Yuga like repetitions that start on a lower plane each time or a lower peak than what's the previous.
Yeah, and I think that that's what he means. So basically, the reason that he emphasizes that this is not fatalism is because fatalism implies that every action has been destined or preordained and cannot be deterred from. And so that's essentially, I feel like the God's plan types that we so often criticize on this channel, the type where we don't have to do anything because we all fall into God's plan, and no matter what we do, our destinies are fated to us. That is what Evola is saying that this is not. He's basically saying that there is a differentiation between imposition and spontaneity, and that there is a certain degree of free will that the individual has. And so fatalism would imply that no matter what, these cycles would continue regardless, because that is what has been ordained, and that is what will happen. Matter of factly can be said, because all of the correct trajectories are set, and there will be no deviation from these trajectories. Right? That's what fatalism is. But he's saying that this is not fatalism because the potential for departure is there within the individual who needs to carry this out. So there's essentially a plan, and there needs to be an adherence to that plan by every member of it. And because of the possibility or potential for that plan to not be adhered to by any member of any given sequence or any member of the acting body, then there is a potential for this not to work out, and the cycle will not be carried over. So this is not fatalism, essentially. This is not predisposed, or this is not, I don't want to say
predestination.
Yeah, it's not predestination. It's predisposed. It's preordained, of course, but it is not predetermined in a sense. It won't happen unless all of the acting bodies correspondingly assume the archetypal reality that or assume the archetypal nature that they need to participate in these higher cycles through their modality within the lower cycles. That's essentially what he's getting at here.
It kind of gets into that left-hand versus right-hand path idea that we were getting at in previous episodes too, where it is those exceptional people that ascend from the caste position that can influence this progression of time because they're going outside this preordainment or fully embodying it, and that's what's sort of driving the direction and trajectory of these things. And so it can either meet its target or it can devolve ever further, like I mentioned previously. So there's a give and take to it all, where it is that repetition spiraling downward, or some great figure, force, divine spirit can intervene and reset the course back to where the trajectory was intended to aim, meet that, and then a whole new cycle is created. But both end up starting with new cycles entirely. I guess both take longer depending on how it's played out, and even what the quality of the cycle is in the first place that determines it. And there could be a multitude of these types of historical or spiritual cycles going on simultaneously that take different times and processions and so on and so forth for them to actually be actualized and sought through, like we've been mentioning with the Kali Yuga, and then things having a larger cosmic scale going down further and further, almost in that sort of spiral like Vincent mentioned earlier, or in a fractalized type of way.
Yeah, and so this is essentially, so he goes in to say right after that, the probably the most important piece concerning time in this chapter. He says, the considerations that follow from these premises are very important. If traditionally empirical time was measured by a transcendent time that did not contain events but meanings, and if this essentially metahistorical time must be considered as the context in which myths, heroes, and traditional gods lived and acted, then an opposite shift acting from below must also be conceived. In other words, it is possible that some historically real events or people may have repeated or dramatized a myth, incarnating metahistorical structures and symbols, whether in part or entirely, whether consciously or unconsciously. And he gives examples about this too. Essentially, he goes on to say that King Arthur, Alexander the Great, King Sebastian, I would add in there Caesar and Charlemagne, figures of those types, who essentially adhere to the archetype and re-portray earlier myths of, let's say, order prevailing over chaos, or the rightful king being restored, or the decadence being overcome by some heroic force. And that's one of the things I wanted to get into also, is that in the Decline of Superior Races chapter, it becomes more significant, but even here it has some significance to it. Whereas in the Greek mythology, you have the golden race, the silver race, the bronze race, and then the race of heroes that comes about in the Iron Age to essentially push back the decadence, right? It's essentially the shield that stops this tidal wave of decadence that has been, washing over the time, in a sense, the timeline. So essentially, this race of heroes is the last-ditch effort of humanity to sort of reconnect with that divine spirituality that can be found in the golden race. And so these races also, these races also correspond to the ages of the yugas, or of the ages you can find in the Nordic sagas or in the Native American sagas. All of this, corresponds with each other in this idea of cyclical time. But the race of heroes has a significance here because people like Alexander the Great, or people like Julius Caesar, or people like Charlemagne, who unify a essential body that is either crumbling or reinstitute something that was once divine and whole and pure, and maybe transform it quantitatively, but still manifest within it the same qualities. That's what these figures here represent. And so I feel like the myth of the heroes is, in a sense, the one that is most commonly necessitated by society, because this decay is so prevalent throughout civilization everywhere, no matter where you look. And so that's essentially what I think that these figures represent. And it's essentially substantiated by Evola's claim that these acting principles from below, which are essentially these physical bodies, these spontaneous actions that correspond to metaphysical significant principles, these signify a reinterpretation or a sort of re-implementation of the mythological principle that was at one point the central focus of the society into which is being re-implemented. It's essentially that principle. Did you have something to add before I went into space, though?
Not really. I was going to mention Liu Bang, the founder of the Han Dynasty, amongst the other figures that you mentioned, is there as well, but it was just another example to kind of reiterate the point.
Okay. So he goes on to talk also about space, and essentially he says, let's see here. If traditional man had an experience of time essentially different from that of modern man, it follows that analogous considerations must be made concerning the experience of space. Space is considered today as the simple container of bodies and of motions, totally indifferent to both. It is homogeneous. A particular idea of it is the objective equivalent of one another, and the fact that a thing is found or an event may take place in one point of space rather than another does not confer any particular quality to the intimate nature of the thing or of that event. And so he says, he goes on to say that in the experience of traditional man, on the contrary, and even in its residues at times present among some savage populations, space is alive and saturated with all kinds of qualities and intensity. The traditional idea of space is often confused with the same manner of vital ether, which is a mystical, all-pervasive substance energy, more material than immaterial, more psychic than physical, often conceived as light and distributed according to various saturations in various regions. Thus, each of these regions seem to possess its own virtues and to participate essentially in the powers that reside in it, so as to make every place a fatidic space endowed with its own intensity and occult individuality. So, it was a very wordy introduction to the topic, but essentially what he's saying is that just as time was measured qualitatively, can't speak here, just as time was measured qualitatively in face of all of the quantitative and sequential events that occurred accidentally one after the other, space is looked upon that same way in the qualitative sense, away from any quantitative interpretation. So basically he's saying that because an event takes place in a given spot, that means that this event is significant to this place, and the event is bestowed with a certain quality, and so is the space because of the event. We were talking...
Or even that the
go ahead.
Space bestows quality on the event itself as well, because there's something that is present essentially within that, physical space that gives this event a quality that it wouldn't have if it were held anywhere else.
We were talking off call a bit a couple weeks ago about something that is like this. It's like if a death occurs in a house and what a haunted space is like. And we were talking about ghosts and things like that. But it really corresponds to this idea here because that event marks that house. And maybe it doesn't have anything to do with actual, residues of the waking eye individual spirit possessing the house, but there is a sort of residual force that exists there in that spot for a long time. And I think that that's what Evola is getting at here, is this idea that things which correspond, or things which transpire in certain areas have certain qualities because they transpire in certain areas, and then also that certain areas have certain qualities because certain things transpire in those areas. So it's like it's like the caste, the birth pre-birth distinction, right? You have the a person is born within a certain caste because the spirit chose to be born as that person, but then also the person is of that caste because they possess that spirit that went into that person. It's kind of like that, where it's a self-perpetuation of and a sort of an infinite regress of principles. And so this is what he uses to describe the idea of the various mythologies associated with different points on the earth or in space. He essentially says that space in antiquity has constantly provided the basis for the most characteristic expression of the metaphysical dimension. The heavenly and the earthly regions, high and low, the vertical and horizontal axis, left and right, were all categories that provided the material for a typical, highly significant, and universal symbolism, one of the most famous forms of which was the symbolism of the cross. And that's actually why I chose the idea for... that's why I actually chose the cross for the focal point of that essay I made on symbolism. Essentially, his thesis for what the Earth is that each spot on the Earth, or each place in space, corresponds to a certain metaphysical principle associated with that space. And the longer that time goes on, or the more cycles that occur there, the more obscured these things become, and the mythologies that occur there often reoccur in that same spot, or are re-dramatized or something like that. And this is I think I mentioned it in the mythological episode, the one that we did on mythology, but there was a certain passage in here that I read that was basically a very good interpretation of what myths actually are. And what he's saying is basically that there is so the priestly caste, or the mystic caste, can determine the quality of a location by going there and essentially feeling, as it were, the various forces that are present within a location. And then the only way that they can interpret this feeling that they have is through a myth which they sort of imagine, but this imagined reality is superimposed onto them. So it's not something that comes from their own will, but something that they discern and interpret through the imaginative modality, or the imaginative faculty of the human modality. And so
That's actually what I wanted to get on next.
oh sure,
Is the paragraph here where he starts off saying the experience of nature, as is understood by modern man, namely as a lyrical, subjectivist pathos awoken in the sentiments of the individual, is absent in traditional man. And that rather than the subjective impressions typical of, romanticism towards the natural world that we have in modernity, the traditional man rather had a real sensation, at times confused, Evola states, of the supernatural, of the powers, noumena, that permeated those places, translating to various images of spirits, gods, elementals, and so on that were associated with different physical phenomena like waterfalls, woods, different types of rocks, etc. And that's reinforcing that point between that sort of traditional sensation that was had there versus our modern conception of it. And you can see that present in, say, like the Greek mythos, or the Native American mythos, or so many other traditional peoples and their myths throughout reality, interfacing these otherwise mundane natural phenomena with ascended spiritual processes in which these natural forces or elements are just the manifestations or symbols thereof from that sort of supernatural element.
An example that he gives is, he says, when in the state of a dream, a physical impression such as the pressure of the blankets is dramatized with the image of a falling rock. This is obviously the case of a fantastic and yet not arbitrary production. The image arose out of necessity, independent from the I, as a symbol, I as in like the letter I, or the waking I state, as a symbol that effectively corresponds to a perception. The same holds true for those fantastic images primordial man introduced in nature. Primordial man, in addition to physical perception, also had a psychic or subtle perception of things and places that was generated by a power of the imagination free from the physical senses and responsible for determining in it corresponding symbolical dramatizations. For example, gods, demons, elementals, and spirits ruling over places and phenomenon. And this right here is I think this is the single most important line in the book, because what he's saying here is that while these myths are the fundamental reference point for traditional society, it doesn't even matter necessarily if these myths are 100% historically accurate, but they can be essentially discovered, in a sense, by the priestly caste, or by those who have the disposition to imagine, by interpreting through the imagination the forces which impose themselves onto the individual in a given set of circumstances. This is excuse me, this is Evola's interpretation of myth right here. And so anything which he says beforehand, such as like the meta-historical time, which must be considered as the context in which myths, heroes, and traditional gods lived and acted, this is what he's saying is the access to that meta-historical time that these gods...
Bit of a Freudian slip there with the medical stuff.
I know. I guess I don't know what that's about. It's happened twice today. But essentially, yeah, this is the imagination is the faculty which is able to tap into that traditional time and re-experience or reinterpret the forces as experiences that they might not be able to put into words or articulate any other way. That's what I see, and I actually 100% agree with this mythological interpretation right here, because it doesn't necessarily always have to be historic events. And I think that part of Evola's disdain with the modern world is the significance attributed to historic events. Like, let's say, for example, a good example is the American emphasis on the Supreme Court decisions, right? For example, all of these decisions are benchmarks in time that can't be undone or have some type of metaphysical significance to them, as much as the word metaphysical can be applied here. But what Evola is saying is that these benchmarks have no metaphysical significance, and the only true significance can be found within the metahistoric or the metaphysical aspect of what these things actually represent. And if there is no correspondence there, then these things are arbitrary and mundane. And so this interpretation of myth reflects that idea by saying that, in a sense, all of these areas are associated with these various forces, which we can only characterize to be this or that god or this or that spirit. Or, like I said, if a person dies in a house and you go into the house, there might be a certain force that someone who is of a certain disposition and has a certain imaginative aspect about them will be able to characterize, maybe not exactly what happened there, but depict a story in which the same elements that occurred, which would be like a death or a traumatic event, they would be able to articulate a story as such, as similar to what happened in that actual event. And so history becomes metahistory, and things that are, mundane chronological events become adapted into this, what he calls the sacred plane or the magical plane. And essentially all of these become quote unquote occult forces in various places that determine the identity of the place. They are the distinguishing factor of the identity of the place. They are what distinguishes the quality of that place apart from every other place in both time and space. That's essentially what he's getting at with this chapter. Go ahead.
The term that he used to denote this, that psychic sensation or psychic perception, rather, was a very good term to kind of coin for that feeling. Because as you keep saying with the haunted house type of scenario, or many others, there is this sort of empathetic type of perception. That's the only real word you can use in this scenario, that even sans all context of a place that you may be standing in, there is a certain energy in which you can discern something have something to have happened in that place, like say a battlefield or standing amongst some ancient ruins where everything perceivably might be to the material eye a perfectly mundane or even jovial experience, like a very nice, bright, sunny day, warm spring afternoon type of disposition. But the place itself is imprinted with a certain energy or chaos or whatever have you, that even if you didn't know something happened there historically, there is some presence felt that many people can discern, knowingly or not, and have that type of vibe, if you were. I'm being very low bar with my terminology right now because I can't think of putting it in any better terms without maybe just quoting Evola directly, but even that doesn't help the point that I'm trying to illustrate.
No, I know exactly what you mean.
One example that I did want to bring up in these last couple of paragraphs here is Ted Kaczynski, and how he is very demonstrative of this point that Evola is making. And even though he comes after Evola by a couple decades, he reassesses these same points and comes to many of the same conclusions as Evola, but falls into the trap that Evola kind of saw beforehand in focusing on things in a hyper-specific tense, like on just the technological denotation that Kaczynski points out. And that's what he gets into the decline of the superior races, the chapter we're going to be getting into in a little bit. But Kaczynski is very much reminiscent of this type of experiencing nature understood by modern man, where he is still enveloped in and a product of modernity, even though he rebels against it as much as he possibly can. It is a subjective, individualistic experience that exists outside that traditional interpretation that was kind of needed for a full awakening that I think Kaczynski was on the path towards, but ultimately
fell short of or deviated
sundered,
on the path.
Yeah, fell short of or made himself asunder through his own actions. And, disavow, but kind of, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. He may not have done the worst actions he could. He may have been on a right path in a way, but he may have gone about that in the wrong way or under the wrong pretenses, the wrong motives, if you were, even if essentially everything else was all there. But Kaczynski, I'd say, is a great mind, just like Evola. Evola just goes one step further, maybe 2 steps further, in seeing the broader spiritual essence with all this greater context around it that I think Kaczynski just fell short of. And he was so disgusted with the modern world, again, being a couple decades past Evola and being deeper into the mire of this involution, that he may have just been blackpilled, for lack of a better term, to go beyond that sort of ascending quality that someone like Evola, and going further back with people like Ganon and things, because we always bring them up, they were able to do by the nature of the time that they were born in themselves.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
I was going to say something along that same lines. Sorry to interrupt, but with Evola and Ganon,
I was done.
They very much grew up in the time where the occult was very big. People like Aleister Crowley existed, not too long before them, and Paris was this huge occult hub with Freemasonry and all of that in the 1920s and all of that. So they grew up in these very spiritual times, or spiritually inclined times, where the occult was very big and where the religious facet of the mainstream society was dying down. You had these, it was still very religious, relative to today, but the idea of the occult and of esoteric philosophy and all of that was so much more open. You had the Theosophical Society as well, or the Hermetic.
You had a lot of break off from orthodoxy.
Exactly. And so Evola and Ganon were able to traverse these various esoteric and occult sciences and institutions and new traditional lineages, and identify, which elements within them were proper and which were not. And, they were able to basically see it firsthand. They were able to be themselves a primary source of all of this information because they studied it themselves. They had contemporaries which wrote about it themselves and even practiced it themselves. And so this was sort of the society in which they were ingrained. But for Kaczynski, he was, born very far after, so he grew up in a already modernized society, whether, it was still earlier than today, but the focal point, there was no emphasis on the spiritual, in a sense that everything that was seen as progress was technology. And so anything that was seen as anti-progress wasn't spiritualism or religiosity, it was anti-technology. And so he fell in that trap which was created for him, which was just set up by the times. That's what I think you're getting at.
Yeah, and it's even beyond that point, because Theodore Kaczynski was born in 1942, so the Frankfurt School and everything else like that was already founded by that point, and many other philosophers and contemporaries to people like Evola himself had already published works pushing the boundaries of modernity into postmodernity by that point as well. So growing up, Kaczynski knew only this consumerist type of further devolved lifestyle all around him in the Western world that was even a greater deviation than the things that Evola was seeing well before then. So you had Evola writing this work right now before Kaczynski was even born, and then still editing it as his life went on, up until his death, decades before Kaczynski even got famous for the things he did, becoming the Unabomber as he were. So it's a very long process of just missing things, and I think Kaczynski is just a very unfortunate victim of his time, and it's a very sad story in a way, because he didn't get a chance to experience some of the greatest aspects of the world in which he envisioned, and was trapped by this ever-present monopolization of forces that pushed out this spiritual awakening that people like Evola were pointing towards as dying throughout the rest of the world, because the whole point of that sort of deviation from orthodoxy and the investment into the occult and further investigations into these practices was all because of this further dying nature of spirituality and religiosity, not just in the West, but everywhere. And the rise of things like the third positionist movements and in various nations or communist revolutions in various nations were all kind of tacit on that fact that everyone was in this very politicized, materialist, lower form state of being that would then, I don't want to say irreversibly, but forever change the course of history as we see it now. And it's our generation, and probably the youngest generation we have now, the Zoomers and upcoming Gen Alpha, that are then seeing this, because everything is pretty much devoid of any spiritual essence, even down to the churches and temples themselves, because they've been so utterly consumed and hollowed out and worn as skin suits. And now we're taking a step back, reassessing everything, and then rediscovering these fundamental truths and essential qualities of the world that, fortunate for us, people like Evola did write down, and that people like Kaczynski took action upon. Again, disavow whether or not that was the correct course of action, but even still, it was an action taken. And it's up to us now to use these political maneuverings that have been already established through postmodernity, as well as the spiritual foundations and the ramifications thereof that so many people like Evola and other great thinkers had established for us to use in tandem to revitalize society, or at least rebuild it, as we are the standing among the ruins, so to speak. I say that a lot. I don't know why, but it just, the man among the ruins line is just so cogent and terse. It delivers the exact essence of the situation we're in. And even without getting into the book, which I think we might in the future, just that one line that Evola puts for the title manifests everything there in that you kind of already know, but he'll put in much better terms.
Exactly. It's got a significance to it in the ruins of what was essentially these great traditional societies. Now we are essentially living in, like what you said, is a society wearing the skin suit of all of the institutions established by the traditional societies, all of the practices and linguistic features and social customs established by these societies, but being flipped on their head in favor of the semantics. It's essentially that hourglass analogy I keep referencing, because it quite literally is the flipping of the semantics and the essence of society in general, and just watching the substance, which is that sand, flow through until there is, no residual of tradition left. It's just a hollow shell of what it once was. And
I'd say our generation are those last trickles, those last grains of sand through the oculi of the hourglass.
Well, that's why I think the race of the heroes is so significant also, or the myth of the heroic race is so significant also, because we are in a time where we essentially need to manifest that heroic principle. A heroic, I'm using that word corresponding to the race within Greek mythology, not necessarily just the idea of heroism in general, which we should be manifesting anyways. But we actually need to have that Greek heroic principle, the idea of holding back that tide of, holding the shield to the waves, as it were, and not letting the rot get to us, so that we can essentially push that back, or at the very least, as Evola says in one of his other books, Ride the Tiger, essentially, let that wave maybe wash over us, but then repair all that is left in its wake. And that's what I think it's the duty of the the folks like us who think this way and study this philosophy and aim to act in some kind of corresponding fashion on what we truly believe in. And so I think that the race of the heroes is very significant among our times, because it signifies the last bastion of true spirituality among the decay of a given civilization. And that's what I think we sort of represent by studying these things and participating in these activities and trying to understand reality as a whole. That's what I think that what significance I think we hold.
Mm-hmm.
But that's about
and
it. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I think to wrap it up before we move into the next chapter, because I think that's where you were going with it, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I was.
I think that was the fatal flaw of Kaczynski himself as well, is he had that acknowledgement, just like Evola did, on whether to fight or to ride the tiger. And maybe it was foolish, maybe it was optimistic, but Kaczynski truly believed that he could, with great help, because that was what the call of his letters were, especially in the Industrial Revolution and its future. Still working on that, by the way, just so everyone knows. But in that letter, he did write, "It will take a swift and enormous effort from a multitude of different people, not just himself, to ultimately fight this industrial complex, i.e. the tiger." And that's what he ended up doing. He wanted to fight the tiger, as it were. Whereas Evola, maybe from a more learned age of wisdom, he had some years on him, versus where they were in their life in terms of writing these works, where he saw that riding the tiger was the only real option, in a sense, because fighting it, you'll just get eviscerated. But writing it out and tiring it out and then subduing it with time, you may take some wounds. It may take a lot longer and be a much more painful process, but you might still survive the encounter altogether, and then you can see where it goes from there.
And that's what I think is the major debate among a lot of people, is that, it's do you fight or do you essentially wait it out? And I honestly think
the quintessential, sorry to interrupt, that is the quintessential fighting point, the ignition point amongst those in the air quote dissident right or sensible centrist or whatever term you want to use. But all of those of us that are on the outer fringes of society trying to shape it or be counter to the values that the regime, the cathedral, the cabal, whatever you want to call it, hold at their center, us being in opposition to that is our reaction to those things and how we approach it. And that is the quintessential division amongst us in these circles, is whether to fight or whether to wait it out. And at this sort of point in history, it seems like both are viable options, but we don't really know, unfortunately, until the time has already passed us. And you can only look at something like this retrospectively.
That's what I was getting at, is that I don't
it's a very hard scenario.
I don't think it's one or the other. I actually think it's a bit of both. You fight what you can and you fight the battles you can win, but you ultimately know you are going to lose and you're going to have to rebuild later. And I feel like these mini victories, in a sense, do serve that overall morale of the fighting man, enough so that he understands what it is by the time everything has collapsed. He understands what it is he needs to rebuild. And so that's why I think it's a bit of both. It's, in a sense, it's not just one or the other, whereas you don't just sit back and do nothing and let the tidal wave roll over, because it's likely that as a metaphor, not everything is going to be destroyed. There's not going to be essentially this Walking Dead-esque zombie apocalypse type of thing where you're going to have to rebuild like that. It's going to be, a little bit more systematic than that. The decay is going to be a little bit closer to the Roman decay, or, the decay of other societies we can look back at and see, how the collapse happened. And it's not going to happen overnight. And, on the other hand, if you are that last Roman, fighting against the barbarian before the before the Horde, kind of takes over, you still understand the realm for which you fight, but it no longer exists, and so you're sort of fighting for a moot point. So both are bad, I think, in their extremes, but to sort of take the path of both, the warrior and the ascetic, or the path of action and the path of contemplation, in a sense, are symbolically the same thing as to act or not to act in a situation like this. So that was kind of my take on it. But that kind of does wrap up the chapter for space, time, and the Earth. We could probably spend hours, honestly, talking about this one chapter, because there is just so much to unpack here. With the first half, even with the second half being the mythological interpretations of this, or the expressions of this sort of interpretation of time and space throughout history. It's just, there is so much to unpack here. So we kind of went over the general gist of it, and we are now going into the chapter of man and woman, which differentiates the principles of the two sexes, the masculine and the feminine. And Evola's take on it, I feel like he gets... One thing I like about Evola is that he gets very explicit with his terms, and he doesn't mince words, and he doesn't hold back from any of what he doesn't hold back from saying what he believes to be the true manifestation of principles. Even if, the modern reader, or, anyone in his direct circle even would say, no, I don't agree with that. Evola will, clearly, like a razor, just cut through all of the semantics that are held up against him, and essentially say, yeah, well, all of what you think is wrong, I think is correct, and there's no undoing that. And he does that with...
Yeah, to be... Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead. No, I was...
Not to be lowbrow about it, but this chapter can be essentially summed up in Hose Mad, and that really is the boiling point of this man and woman chapter, because it's not so much man and woman, it's more so woman, and the consequences thereof. And I thought it was humorous in some aspects too, and in which is why I found it so prophetic, because if only he could see the consequences of the things he's talking about in his lifetime forming today, and what that's manifested into. And oh boy, do we have I guess some things that we all kind of implicitly know, the elephants in the room sort of deal, but seeing that from the foreseeing eyes of Evola, and how that this plays out, and how we may be able to correct it moving forward.
Yeah, it's a very interesting chapter, because like I said, he does not mince words. He does not hold back in any of what he believes in, and what is essentially, like you said, what is kind of implicitly known by most people to be true, but just, they don't like to say it because it is, very unorthodox nowadays to say certain things like this. But Evola doesn't care. He will get right into it, and he will tell you exactly how it is.
That's why it's Evola going hose mad.
Exactly.
But
and
let's get into it.
So he starts it off by saying, to complete these considerations on traditional life, I will now briefly discuss the sexual dimension. In this context, too, we find that in the traditional worldview, realities corresponded to symbols and actions to rites. What derives from these correspondences are the principles for understanding the sexes and for regulating the relationships that are necessarily established between men and women in every normal traditional civilization. In traditional symbolism, the supernatural principle was conceived as masculine, and the principle of nature and of becoming was feminine. In Hellenic terms, the one, which is in itself complete and self-sufficient, is regarded as masculine. Conversely, the dyad, the principle of differentiation and of other than self, is thus the principle of desire and movement, and is regarded as feminine. In Hindu terms, the impassible spirit is masculine, while Prakriti, the active matrix of every conditioned form, is feminine. The Far Eastern tradition has expressed equivalent concepts through the cosmic duality of yin and yang, whereby yang, the male principle, is associated with the virtue of heaven, and yin, the feminine principle, with the principle of the earth. And we've kind of gotten into this in our podcast on man and woman, And I actually I did read excerpts from this chapter itself, because this is probably the biggest source you will find on the proper orientation of man and woman in traditional spirituality, because, like I said, Evola doesn't hold back in it. He doesn't try to interpret the relationships between the various sexes for the modern semantics. He essentially, gets at what they mean and the significances that they have, which, again, for Evola is a very real significance. It's not anything metaphorical or symbolic. It is very much a manifestation of, these various essential principles that can be found within man and woman. And
in fact, oh, sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I was going to add that, in fact, Evola took this topic so seriously. I don't know if this book preceded this chapter, or if this chapter inspired this book, but he wrote an entire book on this topic itself, called Eros and the Mysteries of Love, the Metaphysics of Sex. And that's something where he gets into very, very deeply, and going even further than just this one chapter goes into, all of the delineating qualities of the masculine and the feminine, and the interplay thereof, and the necessary components that exist by the two, for the two, and for society in a broader sense. Not just in, the sexual aspect of things on a reproductive level, but in that spiritual manifestation, of Eros, and that consecration and devotion to another of the opposite sex that he kind of gets into here, and we'll read in just a second. But if you are interested in this topic even more so, that is another book by Evola to go all in on.
Yeah, he very much. I think that was written before this one, but I could be wrong. But I know I see footnotes for it here. Not sure that necessarily means anything, because this is revision.
Yeah, like we said, this book's been revised for half of Evola's life, up into his death.
So it's not necessarily anything significant if there is a footnote, but he does expand upon these principles, very, very deeply in Eros and the Mysteries of Love. I've read a few excerpts from that, and he does go all in. And it's I don't want to say that it's one of the few books where he goes all into a specific topic, because he does this in things like Introduction to Magic or things like that. But this masculine and feminine topic right here, the fact that he wrote a whole book about it shows the significance and importance of it within our society in general, within the traditional society. And so we have to remember also that for Evola, everything that happened in the physical world, once again, is a manifestation of something that was ordained in the metaphysical world. So if you were born as a man, that is because your spirit is that of a man, and there is no changing that, there is no undoing it, there is no miscalculation made in the metaphysical domain that you were born as a man. And the same thing for a woman. If you were born as a woman, then your spirit is that of a woman, and it chose the woman body, and so there is no changing that, there's no undoing it, there's no denying your own nature, there's none of that. And so because this is the case, because everything was preordained metaphysically, this is why things need to be adhered to physically, and why all of this stuff that is, like all of these considerations made right here, should not be taken as offensive or as obscene or even as extreme, because the people or the principles to which these ideas correspond were already preordained and have a proper nature to them. And since they were chosen before they were manifested, they, in a sense, already knew this before going into it, in a sense. Maybe not consciously, but subconsciously.
Trans lobby is going to be angry about this one.
Yeah. So, anyways, the idea is essentially that the masculine principle is the independent and creative principle, and that the feminine principle is the dependent and transmissive or generative principle. And this is actually, so if we can identify a few things with the characteristics attributed to God as well. God as a superior, divine, anterior principle that creates and sustains all things, essentially has both a masculine and a feminine aspect applied to him, or it's, if you were to examine these two principles alone. So the masculine principle is sort of the architect. It is the creative principle that manipulates all of these substances to fit a specific mold and designs all of the hierarchies and systems in which all of these things have a direct function. That's what the masculine principle represents. And the feminine principle, as the generative principle, essentially represents the not the creation of sorts, but like I said, the generation of sorts, where it is, in a sense, the I don't want to say creator because that has specific connotations, but where all of the substances,
it's like the curator, you could say.
Yeah, the curator, in a sense, where the substance becomes of the feminine principle and then is shaped by the masculine principle. And so because the substance itself has no form to it, it requires the masculine, it requires the creative principle to give it form. And so this is why the feminine aspect corresponds to the earth and the masculine aspect corresponds to metaphysics, because temporal reality is shaped by metaphysics. So anything that happens within temporal reality is directly influenced by the domain of metaphysics. So anything that the feminine principle creates is directly influenced by the masculine principle and requires it to take any type of form or have any type of identity. And so on top of this, you have the masculine principle being independent because it is able to understand that which it is without any type of manifestation, and the feminine principle is dependent because the manifestation requires an essence to be a priori to it to then take some type of form. And so you have the... Oh, go ahead.
You could almost say that this is a form of the... Oh, how was it that we put it in previous episodes? The path of becoming and... What was the other one?
The path of being and the path of becoming?
Yes. Whereas the feminine is the path of being and the masculine is the path of becoming, in a sort of sense. The what could be versus what is, in lower and higher terms.
It's the opposite. The path of being is the...
Or...
Yeah.
Yes.
But I know what you're saying. Yeah, the path of the masculine path is the aspect of being, because the masculine principle is independent in its own right and does not have that characteristic that is attributed to the feminine principle, which is which I'll get into a bit later, which is that emotional, carnal, instinctive characteristic, and is more logical and mathematical. And so yeah, the man is very much being, and the woman very much represents becoming, because the creation will always have the same design, but the manifestation will not always be the same thing. So the generation constantly needs to keep occurring to substantiate the manifestation, whereas the creation just needs to occur once. And that's essentially the highest point of reference for the masculine and the feminine principles. And Evola gets into here with this chapter a lot more of the spiritual implications of these things and the social interactions between these various beings and manifestations of these principles, so man and woman. He says... Mm-hmm. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to read as well, but you go first.
He says, considered in and of themselves, these two principles are in opposition to each other, but in the order of creative formation that I've repeatedly identified as the soul in the traditional world, and that was destined to develop historically in relation to the conflict between various races and civilizations, they're transformed into elements of a synthesis in which both retain a distinctive function. And he goes on to talk about the fall for a second. So the fall is essentially the eating of the apple, the fall of the golden age, divine spiritual regality that you can find in that time, which is characterized as the woman, or which is characterized as the man succumbing to his desire for the woman or for whatever it is the woman has to offer, and losing his independence because he becomes reliant on that feminine principle. He says, we often find the idea of the male principle's identification with and loss in the feminine principle until the former has acquired the latter's way of being. So until the man has acquired the woman's way of being. In any event, when this happens, when that which is naturally a self-subsistent principle succumbs to the law of that which does not have its own principle in itself by giving in to the forces of desire, then it is appropriate to talk about a fall. On the plane of human reality, the difference that various traditions have nurtured towards women is based precisely on this belief. The woman is often considered as a principle of sin, impurity, and evil, as well as a temptation and a danger for those who are in search of the supernatural. Nevertheless, it is possible to consider another possibility that runs counter to the direction of the fall, and that's to establish the correct relationship between the two principles. He says that this occurs when the feminine principle, whose force is centrifugal, does not turn to fleeting objects, but rather to a virile stability in which she finds a limit to her restlessness. Stability is then transmitted to the feminine principle to the point of intimately transfiguring all of its principles. What occurs in these terms is a synthesis in a positive sense. What is needed, therefore, is a radical conversion of the feminine principle to the opposite principle. Moreover, it is absolutely necessary for the masculine principle to remain wholly itself. So, basically what he's saying is that the fall depicts the masculine principle succumbing to the feminine principle, and something that is absolute crumbling into something that is relative, trying to condition itself into something that is relative and has no point of reference. The masculine principle itself represents that idea that there is no rejection of desire because the desire was already not there in the first place. The masculine principle is very, at its core, it is archetypally calculated and does not require any type of lesser or more relative attribute projected onto it, such as things like desire or instinct or temptation or anything which we can consider animalistic within man. This is not the masculine principle. This is the feminine principle. And the feminine principle has the masculine principle as its point of reference. So the creative principle exists before the generative principle, and the generative principle has the creative principle as its point of reference. That is essentially what is characterized by Adam and Eve. That is why Adam is created first and Eve is created from the rib of Adam, because the feminine principle has in itself the reference point in the masculine principle. But the masculine principle was created first, regardless of, or in lieu or in spite of the fact that the feminine principle did not exist to counter it. And then once it did exist, it was the necessary path for the masculine principle to remain itself, and then for the feminine principle to substantiate that principle by finding within the masculine principle a proper place to, in a sense, reside. The proper principles within the masculine principle to then take upon herself and wholly immerse herself within. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah, and that's actually demonstrated further in some of the myths that Evola brings up as examples for these, I guess, metaphysical facts, as you will, or truths. Excuse me. Violated one of my own principles there, the truth over fact ordeal. But in the Kalki Avatara, that is one that I wanted to get into specifically, but that's getting ahead of ourselves because there's a few more things to get into before we move on to those points that Evola makes.
Yeah. So essentially, Evola states that the same principle that creates the caste system creates the man-woman distinction. It's that same hierarchical principle, which is why I all of these things that Evola references, right? You have the caste system, you have the two paths in the afterlife, you have the the greater and lesser types of being, you have the masculine and the feminine, you have the ascetic and the warrior, and then the non-initiated, you have the initiated and then the non-initiated. And all of these things, you have the patrician and the plebeian, right? All of these things represent the same fundamental essence, which is the greater type of being, the archetypal, metaphysical, essential type of being, and the lesser type of being, which is more conditioned and reliant upon that greater archetypal version of itself to exist. And so this is why I disagree with Evola in the fact that he is so rigid in his implementation of these systems, and that he doesn't necessarily consider their overlap or their gray areas. He doesn't decategorize in the way that he says that one should decategorize, but I can see exactly why he's saying this and why he essentially hammers home these points so hard, because these are all manifestations of the same general idea, which is that greater and lesser type of being projected onto these various social spheres. So for the social hierarchy in general, you have the castes. For the human principle itself, you have the sexes. For, the ascetic, you have the warrior and the contemplator. For the individual, you have the initiated or the uninitiated. All of these things are manifestations of this greater and lesser type of being.
I think Evola's deal with the rigidity in his categorizations is because that process of delineating the gray areas in between these stages might be part of the involutive process as well. And so that's him buttressing against that sort of deterioration moving forward, because these things are all sort of divinely inspired and of a higher quality. So it would make sense as to not have them be, how would you say?
Overlapped or confused with one another.
Yeah, transmutated between the two. It's hard and fast distinctions, because these divinely inspired things should be the ideal, and the ideal shouldn't have any sort of wiggle room in between it, because it is the ideal. It is of this higher essential truth that manifests beyond just the physical realm, and any delineation between that doesn't quite fit within it is just corruption of that of those processes within the physical realm, as it were. And that's not necessarily kind of giving leeway to the whole demiurge type of mentality, but it gives a little nod and a nudge, kind of conceding that this deterioration does happen. And you can see that in any spiritual path, that whether it be Hindu or Christian or whatever, there's an obvious recognition that these manifestations materially will always devolve into less and less refined versions of themselves moving forward. And then, as we've already established, the cycle will pick up again and repeat.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense, and I can sort of resonate with that too, because there needs to be clear distinction as to what function is attributed to what principle and whatnot. But I think that what Evola's trying to do here is get at the similarities between all of the traditions, and to get at these similarities, there can't be any rigidity. There certainly can, but there can't be the type of rigidity that Evola is applying to these concepts when you're trying to get at the similarities between what are essentially two very different manifestations. I've used the example before of like a tree, right? You have the idea of, like if I told a room full of people to picture a tree, you might have some that picture like an evergreen tree, but some that would picture a maple tree. And the maple tree, for example, loses its leaves in the winter, but the evergreen tree does not. But both of these participate in the reality of being tree-like. And so this distinction of one losing its leaves and one not is essentially a minor detail that does not impede the participation in being tree-like. Whereas I feel like he's saying that if, the caste system is, 3 and not 4, or 6 and not 5, or you know what I mean, like 6 and not 4, or if there's different types of caste distinction, then his focus on the number 4, I think, is the issue, not necessarily the rigidity of the system itself, where these functions, I think, correspond to different levels of divinity, which is sort of requires a decategorization, whereas what he's focused on is, in a sense, that formalistic rigidity that might not be the same everywhere. And so you might find he might find a tradition that is equally as valid, but it doesn't, adhere to his very specific, set of, rigid castes, and he might dismiss that as invalid, even if all of the other elements are there. And that's what I think is the danger of that, is that might not happen. You might never come across that happening at all. But the fact that that's a danger and a potential there is what I think he just needs to abstractify just a little bit more. But we're kind of getting off into the weeds with this. But he basically says that, man and woman, the principles that, or the principle that dictates the purpose and function of the masculine and feminine principles. So the idea that predicates these functions is the same idea that manifests itself in the caste system. And so he says that this norm obeys the principle of the caste system, and it also emphasizes the two cardinal tenets of dharma and bhakti, or fides, a self-subsistent nature and an active dedication. And so he talks about the path of heroism for man, right? This whole entire book has basically been a guide to heroism for man, right? Or a guide to the world of tradition for a man. He talks about the contemplative and the active aspect of being an ascetic. He talks about the, professional associations and the caste system, but the caste system only applies to a man for Evola. And that's another thing that I think is a little bit too rigid, in my opinion. But regardless.
Well, he does reinforce that point here a little bit later on with how the feminine aspect does play into the caste system, but not independent of the man. I think that's the part that doesn't have so much rigidity into it.
Yeah, that I can see. But anyways, he goes on to say that he goes on to characterize the heroic, or the way in which the woman can participate in the world of tradition, and that is what he calls the feminine heroic aspect. He says, I've already considered the way of being that corresponds eminently to man. And so when he says the way of being, he means that way of superior being, not necessarily the way of existing, right? And so he says, I have also discussed the two main paths of approach to the value of being a principle to oneself, namely action and contemplation. Thus the warrior, or the hero, and the ascetic represent two fundamental types of pure virility. In symmetry with these types, there are also two types available to the feminine nature. A woman realizes herself as such, and even rises to the same level reached by a man as a warrior and ascetic, only as a lover and a mother. So, what he's saying here is that there is two types of devotion that a woman can find herself manifest through. And the reason it is devotion that a woman finds herself actualized through, and not any independent type of activity, is again because of the dependency of the generative principle on the creative principle, and the dependency of the feminine principle on the masculine principle to be truly identified. So this devotion, this devotive aspect, manifests itself in the idea of love, which again is the idea of a type of devotion to. It's not love as a possession of. And so Evola gets at this later on in very explicit detail. But the idea for being a woman is to love unconditionally, which is to devote oneself to a given thing unconditionally. This is also why he characterizes the Christian religion as being feminine, because it is a devotive religion. The practitioners of Christianity are expected to devote themselves to God, whereas, let's say in the Greek tradition, the participation in this quote-unquote religion, it wasn't really a religion, but it was a tradition. The participation in the tradition required a little bit more of an independent and masculine activity to it. But that's, again, off into the weeds. So he says that only as a lover and a mother can a woman be fully or truly spiritually actualized. He says these are bipartitions of the same ideal strain. Just as there is active heroism, there is also a passive heroism. There's a heroism of absolute affirmation and a heroism of absolute dedication. And so the absolute affirmation is the masculine one, and the absolute dedication is the feminine one. They can both be luminous and produce plenty of fruits as far as overcoming human limitations and achieving liberation are concerned, when they are lived with purity and in the sense of an offering. The differentiation of the heroic strain determines the distinctive character of the paths of fulfillment available to men and women. He says, in the case of women, the actions of the warrior and of the ascetic, who affirm themselves in a life that is beyond life, the former through pure action and the latter through pure detachment, these correspond to the act of the woman totally giving of herself and being entirely for another being, whether he is the loved one or the son. And he says that the type of the lover is the aphrodistic woman, or the son is the Demetrian woman. He says, finding in this dedication the meaning of her own life, her own joy, and her own justification. So, it's the devotion of the woman either to her husband or to her child. And that if she were to have a child, this child must be a son. That's why in traditional societies, the emphasis on having a son was so important, was because it wasn't just for the masculine aspect to be reproduced, but it was also for the feminine aspect to sort of develop, as it were, with the mother dedicating her essential nature to her own offspring, to her son, which is also the continuation of the lineage and so on. So here he says that, in a sense, and remember, this is a very big point of contention, right? Because in modern society, we would not take this as anything legitimate, to say that a woman can only be truly fully actualized in devotion to another person rather than independently. That's, blasphemous to modern society. But to traditional society, where every action and every birth corresponded to a metaphysical event, where the body was chosen at birth or pre-birth by the spirit, knowing the fundamental nature of the principle to which it was going to be, or the principle of which it was going to be a manifestation, that's when this becomes a little bit more less restrictive and even more liberating in a sense, because it is that principle fully actualizing itself through the conscious being. And the consciousness is really the only impeding factor here, because that and the moral factor being the only impeding factor here. And that's why in this book, Evola has stressed the importance of detachment from morality, but instead to something which I would call propriety, being a proper manifestation of, right, rather than a moral adherence to, because morals can be questioned, but propriety and a given rigidity cannot. And so when this birth is considered beforehand, and it is considered a manifestation of, then the only path for this actualization happens to be in the devotion. And so that is, again, not oppressive. In the same way that the being in a certain caste is not oppressive, or, being of a certain vocation or disposition is not oppressive. And so that's why the traditional society had this type of aspect to it when it came to the masculine and the feminine. And you can see this principle being sort of carried through the ages and, having various different manifestations. And Evola gets at some of that later on. He goes into the various traditions in which the feminine principle can be found devoting itself to the masculine principle in various ways, whether it be through the Islamic harem, or whether it be through the what was it that was called, the sati, I believe is what it's called, where the widow would sacrifice herself to her
yes, to her husband's
deceased
funeral pyre. And I actually had because Evola brings up that tradition was swiftly ended under Western contact, and I actually have the quotes from the British officer Sir Charles James Napier that confronted the practitioners of this tradition, because it wasn't universal across India, but it was a specific subpart of India in their dedication of the Hindu tradition that expressed this form of the lover from the female heroic perspective.
And so he says, therefore, a woman could traditionally participate in the sacred hierarchical order only in a mediated fashion through her relationship with a man. A little bit before this, and I think this is one of the most important lines of this chapter, he says, to realize oneself in an increasingly resolute way, according to these two distinct and unmistakable directions, to reduce in a woman all that is masculine, and in man everything that is feminine, and to strive to implement the archetypes of the absolute man and the absolute woman. This was the traditional law concerning the sexes according to their different planes of existence. And so this is when he goes on to characterize these various traditions. He talks about, again, how in India women did not have their own initiation. He says even when they belonged to a higher caste, before they got married, they didn't belong to the sacred community of the noble ones other than through their fathers, and when they were married, it was through their husbands, who also represented the mystical head of the family. And he goes in to say, the same type of thing can be found in the Greek tradition and in the Roman tradition, where the woman was, in a sense, seen as not as an equal, but as he says they were juridically regarded as a daughter of her own husband and as a sister of her own children. When she was a young girl, she was under the potestas of her father, which was the leader and priest of his own gens. And when she was married, according to a rather blunt expression, she was in manu viri, which I believe means in the possession of man, or in the hands of man. And he says these traditional decrees regulating a woman's dependency can also be found in other civilizations. Far from being unjust and arrogant, as the modern free spirits are quick to decry, they helped to define the limits and the natural place of the only spiritual path proper to the feminine nature. So,
and this path is still held and maintained in many cultures, even among modernity. Say like the Japanese, or like the not the Shakers, but the what are they called? The religious sect of people in the U.S., typically Pennsylvania. Who are they? Oh goodness, Vincent, help me out here.
I don't know. There's quite a few.
The ones that are opposed to technology.
Oh, the Amish?
Amish, thank you. Wow. I blanked out hard. Even the Mennonites in certain respects too, but they're not as stringent as the Amish are. But various cultures and civilizations like this still hold hard and true to that aspect of life. Many Asiatic cultures, Japanese was just a particular example, but the Chinese as well, and I'm more or less ignorant on other Asiatic cultures. I think the Mongolians hold this to be true also, but it's still much stronger over there than it is particularly in the West. In Islamic cultures, it's still held very highly as well, but that's even getting twisted in many forms due to Western influences. But this is still present and can be observed and appreciated in different respects. So it's not just all gone, and you can't. We don't have any basis or reference point to see it in person anymore.
Yeah, and essentially, so he gets at the principle at the core of the idea of all of these different manifestations of devotion, right? And so this is the rest of this chapter is kind of characterizing the way in which a woman devotes herself to a man, and the most extreme cases were the ones that we detailed. He outlines the jumping of a woman onto the funeral pyre of her deceased husband in India. And we have the same type of thing being observed in Germanic traditions as well, and things like that. And he says that, according to the traditional teaching, the woman who followed her husband in death attained heaven. She was transformed into the same substance as her deceased husband, since she partook of that transfiguration into a divine body of light, symbolized among Aryan civilizations by the ritual burning of the cadaver. So, essentially, they are the same ashes. That's basically what he's saying. And because of that, they are the same metaphysical they are the same metaphysical substance as well, as insofar as there is a metaphysical substance, and ascend to the same place, whether that be, heaven, or however you want to characterize the superior afterlife. But he also talks about the idea of the Islamic harem, and the reason that I wanted to touch upon this specifically is because this is entirely foreign to Western civilization, even among the late Roman period. Like, for so long, the love that a woman feels is to be reciprocated by the man in the same exact fashion, in the same manner in which she expresses it for the man. So the woman will devote herself to the man, but then the man is also expected to devote himself to the woman. And Islam, essentially the idea of the harem, is essentially a direct antithetical manifestation of that idea in the traditional principle of the woman devoting herself to the man, but not being able to take possession of him. And that's because this love that the woman gives the man, this devotion that the woman gives the man, is not a what's the word? It's not a possessive devotion. It is a sort of, it is a selfless and a selfless and total devotion, if that makes sense. And so he says that in Islam, the institution of the harem was inspired by these motivations. In Christian Europe, it would take the idea of God for a woman to renounce her public life. In Islam, a man sufficed to provide such a motivation, and the cloistered life of a harem was considered as a natural thing that no well-born woman would ever criticize or intend to avoid. It seemed natural for a woman to concentrate all of her life on one man only, who was loved in such a vast and unselfish way as to allow other women to share in the same feeling and to be united to him through the same bond and the same dedication. So, in a sense, the same type of rejection that is found in the path of the ascetic, of, all of the carnal instincts and desires that, man feels, or of the material impulses that man feels, that same rejection is applied to the feminine principle in this context of any type of jealousy felt by the attention that a man gives to another woman, or by the lack of reciprocation of that same type of devotion from the man. Because the man, again, is independent, and regardless of whether or not the woman was there, the principle would still be independent, whereas the woman represents the principle that is dependent, and so she has to latch herself onto this. And the man can serve as that hub, at least in the Islamic tradition, for a bunch of these dependent principles. And that it seems so, it was not shocking to read. I don't want to say shocking, but it was a very jarring thing to read, as a Westerner, as someone who, for the first time, was taking a look into this type of, this type of spirituality, and seeing the fact that this is metaphysically justified, where for so long we have in the West, criticized and, plastered the system all over the, basically to hell and back, saying, denouncing it and this and that. And you could see someone like Evola, who has this clear-cut reason as to why this tradition existed in the first place, and why it is wrong for people who do not participate in this tradition to criticize it. Because in Islam, this is the manifestation of the devotion of a woman to the man, or the assumption of the feminine principle by the masculine principle. And I don't think that this Evola, he says here, it goes without saying that I am not referring here to the harem or analogous institutions in mere materialistic terms. I have in mind what the harem meant to the pure traditional idea and the superior possibility inspiring these institutions. So, he's not necessarily saying that every tradition should just have a man go out and marry like 20 women. You know what I mean? That's not what he's saying. What he's saying that is that in the context of the Islamic tradition, this principle is the manifestation of the devotion that can be found from the feminine to the masculine principle, or the assumption of, again, the masculine principle of many manifestations of the feminine principle to allow for their spiritual actualizations as well. And this is just attributed to this tradition right here. That's kind of what my take on it was. Did you have anything you wanted to add?
Well, I was looking into that as you were speaking. The Church of Latter-day Saints as well, that hold on to this in the Western perspective, and have that sort of harem aspect about it. Though a man is still, from the Christian's perspective, as much as, the Mormon Church wants to associate itself with Christianity, though other sects of Christianity would disagree, that a man is sort of in multiple monogamous relationships with women, as confusing as that sounds, in this sort of workaround of a harem in their church. Now, there is a split between the churches. There's the, I think, SLDS and the LDS, and I forget which one is which, but only one has the polygamous marriages as opposed to the other, which is monogamous. So there's a bit of a distinction there in regards to that devotional aspect of the feminine in, say, a Western spiritual path. I had a bit more to say too, but I'd have to recollect my thoughts on this deviation I was looking into.
No problem. And so he says, the same holds true for the Western emancipation of women. which is on its way to infecting the rest of the world faster than a plague. Traditional woman, or the absolute woman, in giving herself, in her living for another, in wanting to be only for another, being with simplicity and purity fulfilled herself, belonging to herself, displayed her own heroism, and even became superior to ordinary men. So,
I remembered the other things I wanted to say, going back to sati.
oh, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, like I mentioned before Vincent read into that paragraph thereof, the contact of the traditions of sati and the Western world were kind of irreconcilable in a sense. And so when India came under British occupation, like I mentioned, Charles James Napier was a British officer under he was governing a fleet under the British East Indies Company, but put an end to that practice fairly sturdily. And the quote he's quoted as saying in this conversation between him and the chief guru that oversaw these traditions was, "Be it so, this burning of widows is your custom. Prepare the funeral pile. But my nation also has a custom: when men who burn women alive, we hang them, and confiscate all their property. My carpenters shall therefore erect gibbets on which to hang all concerned. To hang all concerned when the widow is consumed. Let us all act according to our national customs." And so there's a bit that Evola was pointing out there in a sort of lamentation against the Western contact to these more, I guess, ascetic form, or I guess this heroic display of the feminine quality in India. But I don't necessarily see a conflict there in the ending of the practice, because there is a bit of that heroic quality still within the masculine being presented through the British expansionism, but also in their interpretation of the feminine, like protection of the feminine form and the devotional aspect that women had in their societies. And so I think it was quite a cherry on top that this point was made by Sir Charles on people acting according to their customs, and the powers that be asserting their customs over those who cannot assert themselves over the other. And it's not necessarily that the point is missed in this sort of higher vision that this woman is devoting herself beyond her own physical body to a man who she's bequeathed and consecrated this devotion to, but it's to the point of disrespecting the life thereof, seen from the Western perspective, especially the Christian perspective, that is in the form of suicide, which is seen as a sin to be ended entirely. And so it was the perception that this was more or less a murder or an assisted suicide of sorts of someone who could still live their life and devote themselves in other aspects, rather than this, very poetic means of devotion, but otherwise barbaric pretense, as Evola pointed out, was the perception from the British occupiers. And there's the form of, widows living on after their husbands in Western societies and still maintaining multiple aspects of their husbands' legacies. So many so that it's women taking care of their husbands' estates, or taking care of their children, or so on and so forth, that go beyond just the devotion to the man themselves, but the impression the man left in their lifetime that the woman takes care of and devotes herself to in Western societies. And we even have an expression similar to the burning of the pyre, but not as extreme, whereas husband and wife will have themselves buried next to each other in their funeral plots, carrying on that tradition as a dedication to each other even beyond death, so that they're even in death still close to each other, side by side, so as not to be separated even beyond the material terms.
That's also not to mention the numerous queens that would rule after the death of their king, and do all they could to honor the king that died, and if it were to be an untimely death, at the hands of someone else, to exact a type of revenge against, whoever it was that caused the king to die. And so that's all of that is a manifestation of the devotion that can be, seen from the feminine principle to the masculine principle. It's
There's one medieval queen in particular that I was thinking of as you were talking about that. Eastern European, I'm not sure if it's Romanian. I'd have to look into it, but I think we've brought it up on the show before. That's queen in particular, and how she did kind of go on a rampage in response to political actors assassinating her husband, and then just going full like desolation mode on any of those who were complicit in or trying to take advantage of the situation on the part of her husband being killed. And that was another example of, that devotional aspect from a Western perspective, going beyond the life of the man himself.
Yeah. I remember you bringing her up, and I did some research on her myself. I can't remember the name either, but it was somewhere in Eastern Europe. Romania sounds familiar, but in any case,
moving on.
Yeah. In any case, so this devotive aspect of the woman, essentially, is the selfless idea, and the once again the correlation and alignment of that inferior feminine principle with that superior masculine principle. And so I don't want to say that these are qualitatively inferior or superior, because that's not what Evola meant here. It's quantitatively superior or inferior, that's not what Evola meant here. It is a quality that is bestowed upon these that are hierarchically superior and subordinate. And so he says that when a woman, before consecrating herself to a man, pretends that he belongs to her body and soul, not only has she already humanized and impoverished her offering, but worse yet, she's begun to betray the pure essence of femininity in order to borrow characteristics typical of the male nature, and possibly the lowest of these, the yearning to possess and lay claims over another person, and the pride of the ego. He says after that everything else came tumbling down in a rush, following the law of acceleration. Eventually, because the woman's increased egocentrism, men will no longer be of interest to her. She will only care about what they will be able to offer her to satisfy her pleasure or her vanity. In the end she will even incur forms of corruption that usually accompany superficiality, namely a practical and superficial lifestyle of a masculine type that has perverted her nature and thrown her into the same male pit of work, profits, frantic activity, and politics. And that was one of the things I wanted to read verbatim, because in a sense, that is 100% what happened. And you can look at the mundane life of women now, pretty much
not just the mundane, the desolate form of life that partakes in the modern woman nowadays. I don't mean to cut you off, but I have so many examples I could point to and fully paint the picture of as a consequence of this exact mentality that bleeds into our situation nowadays.
Oh yeah, go ahead if you would like to.
Okay, so we get into it a little bit on the episode of the sexes and love in modernity. I think that's the episode that we named it.
The Romance in the Kali Yuga.
Yes, Romance in the Kali Yuga. That was it. And we only touched upon this bit a little portion of, because we were focusing on different aspects of things. But this is where Evola wasn't holding back any punches, and he saw everything coming downhill, as saying, the fallen ones, because they've lost this sort of divine light, this guiding principle, and moving beyond their limitations, as he set forth earlier in the chapter, because they have moved beyond the limiting masculine principle that they ought to be devoting themselves to. And that's why I said that, in this chapter, it's Evola basically saying Ho's mad, because he did coalesce this sort of feminist poison that had started to crop up in the early 20th century, and even the late 19th century, because you can see the roots going as far back there, because of this feminization and domestication of modern man as well. And so this limiting factor then became inadequate and produced women of a variety of trying to replace the man themselves in society by not embodying a sort of pure feminine aspect that can be independent of a man, but trying to recreate a masculine vision of themselves while still trying to maintain this sort of female aesthetic in a way. And as you can kind of guess, that devolves further into this sort of trans amalgamation, transhumanist, transsexual type of deterioration even further. So far rejecting people's natural born sex, which is, the one of the very first things Evola states in the chapter, and what we would try to emphasize so rigidly, because that is a direct, cascading consequence of these effects coming in. And so now you have modern women not even going into the worst of it with the transgender stuff, but modern women living in that sense of vanity and hedonism, being addicted to things like Instagram or TikTok for constant validation and attention, being overtly needy and bold and overemphasizing their own worth in society, not being able to have any real essential quality to them, any inherent value within the societal structure itself, because of this deterioration of the masculine principles that would otherwise limit their erratic, sinful, chaotic natures that were kind of being established therefore. And it's not, none of this was saying to demonize women in any sense, but that's sort of the inherent dark side of women that can be unleashed if left untethered. The same is true for men in a sense, but that goes in a whole nother direction of, say, like war and genocide type of stuff. It's a whole different level of darkness.
Yeah, he actually gets at the what happens when the man is untethered in that same way in later chapters.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways,
but
yeah. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
It's more of this expression of the modern woman that is just devoid of accountability, of self-respect, of a mutual respect for other people, and that's ever present in this disease of hookup culture that further deteriorates the feminine spirit thereforth. And there was even a post I saw earlier today, which was a tweet. Someone that's seemingly unknown, but a fellow by the name of Joe Lambton, that says if you, and he uses more lowbrow language, but I'll translate. If you, sorry, in the process of trying to make this not as profane. Aggravate a woman, she'll get drunk in the club and give fellatio to another man. But if you aggravate a woman that's a virgin, she'll cry in her room still thinking of you. The moral being, the more bodies she has, the easier it is to forget you. But the more she's, the looser she is, let's say, the more difficult it is to love a man at all. So there's that sort of quantitative reality pushing out the qualitative nature of women. And so there's this hijacking of the heroic path of women being the lover and transfiguring it into something completely alien of itself, that is a sort of inversion of what it's meant to be. And so now it's this slut culture, more or less, that has women more addicted to themselves, devoting everything to their own vanity and, like Evola states here, their own egocentrism, and not really understanding that that's just going to hurt them in the long run. And not just themselves, but civilization on the whole. And I could bring up dozens, if not hundreds, of videos of so many women, both famous and just regular average people, on podcasts or on interviews or any number of different situations, admitting to this thing and thinking nothing of it, and so many men being flabbergasted at the sense that this is how women genuinely feel. But it's the fact that men have tolerated this behavior to be exhibited in the first place that we've gotten to this point at all. And that's going as far back as, the late 19th century and maybe even a little further before then, tolerating women to go so far out of these bounds because of our own domestication and lack of assertion of our masculine principles. But that's getting more off into the weeds for possibly a future conversation.
It's also the
and
flipping.
I'd want to have, Vincent take the wheel again.
I was going to say it's also a flipping of the morality of the masculine morality on its head to try to justify an emancipation of women from the actual nature of what a woman is.
It's having the man be devoted to a woman rather than the woman being devoted to a man, and having this culture of simpery, more or less.
Exactly. And so it's funny because when you look at it that way and when you see what's happening, actually Evola characterizes that as, in traditional societies, because it happens as well in tradition, he characterizes that as the civilization of the mother and of the lunar spirituality or feminine spirituality. And he talks about the symbol of the matriarch going forward into the next chapters. And this does bear some significance throughout the rest of the book. And
sorry about that.
Oh, no problem. And so this does bear some significance throughout the rest of the book. But when you see modern woman be, as he said, thrown into the same male pit of work, profits, frantic activity, and politics, these are masculine traits being attempted to be, what is the term, superimposed, or it's like trying to stick a round hole or a round peg in a square hole, or as the saying goes.
Maybe the other way around.
Yeah, exactly.
We get what you're saying.
Exactly. So basically, it's essentially that, where you're trying to attach elements of this foreign type of being onto a being that does not accept these foreign elements. And so what it does is it transfigures the man differently than it does the woman, because when the feminine aspect is attached onto the man, he becomes this pursuant of something that he wants to possess, but also something that he wants to devote himself to. It is a confusion within the man of whether or not he wants to devote himself to his wife or possess his wife, right? And oftentimes it is a fusion of both. Whereas within the woman, it becomes almost an apathy for all things that have any type of independent personality to them whatsoever. He even says here that the modern woman, in wanting to be for herself, has destroyed herself. The personality she so much yearned for is killing all semblance of female personality in her. And so basically the people now who are the women now, especially the younger ones who are addicted to social media or whatever, who may not even have any hobbies or any type of interest in something that is qualitatively other than interacting with their social circle and getting attention from various people. And that's not to say that that people who do that are bad, but they are victims of this change in philosophy that says that the woman needs to be independent and the man needs to be dependent. And it's a consideration that's not necessarily made, because the problems that we face in society are often analyzed to the extent where they think that where the conclusion is often there needs to be more of this involution, but the fact of the matter is there should be less of it, especially in the way of that Evola characterizes the transpirations that are going to occur chronologically as things go on. So he ends this chapter by saying, "It is easy to foresee what will become of the relationship between the sexes, even from a material point of view. Here too, like in magnetism, the higher and stronger the creative spark, the more radical the polarity. The more a man is a man, the more a woman is a woman." He says, "What could possibly go on between these mixed beings lacking all contact with the forces of their deepest nature? Between these beings for whom sex is reduced to the physiological plane? Between these beings who, in the deepest recesses of their souls, are neither men nor women, or who are masculine women or feminine men, and who claim to have reached the full sexual emancipation while only truly having regressed? All relationships are destined to have an ambiguous and crumbling character. the comradely promiscuities and morbid intellectual sympathies, such as are commonplace in the new communist realism. In other words, modern women will be affected by neurotic complexes and all the other complexes which Freud constructed a science that is truly a sign of our times. He says that the possibilities of the world of the emancipated woman are not dissimilar. The avant-gardes of this world, North America and Russia, are already present, and give interesting and very meaningful testimonies of this fact. All this cannot but have repercussions of an order of things that goes way beyond what our contemporaries, because of their recklessness, will ever suspect. And that is how he ends the chapter. And I think that that's a very... he ends it with a flare of drama at the end there, because it is true. In the same way that a discontinuity from all of these metasocial structures, such as like caste, or the idea of a universal empire, or the race of the soul, the spirit, and the body, all of these things, all of these deconstructions of these things, the delineation of the lesser from the greater, in a sense, is what characterizes the downfall of a society. The downfall of a society, and this in holistic fashion is translated into this idea of the masculine and the feminine principles, where the delineation of the feminine archetype from the feminine manifestation and the delineation from the masculine archetype from the masculine manifestation is very catastrophic for the social order in general, because as he outlined previously, and as he will outline in going forward, these have specific not inclinations, but these have specific partitions attributed to them, and specific properties that they are manifestations of, because they are preordained, because they are supposed to be this way. It's almost like you design a building, right? And you design the concrete to be the foundation and the glass for the window, but now the glass is the foundation and the concrete is the window. It has very catastrophic tendencies for the actual manifestation of the building, even if the design doesn't actually change. And so that's what this here is trying to represent with the man and the woman.
And I think to properly close it out, just a few paragraphs before that closing passage that you read, he does put the onus on men in this situation, saying that in a society that no longer understands the figure of the ascetic and the warrior, in which the hands of the latest aristocrats seem to better fit to hold tennis rackets or shakers for cocktail mixers than swords or scepters, in which the archetype of the virile man is represented by a boxer or a movie star, if not by the dull wimp represented by the intellectual, the college professor, the narcissistic puppet of the artist, or the busy, dirty, money-making banker and the politician. In such a society, it was only a matter of time before women rose up and claimed for themselves a, air quote, personality and, quote, freedom, according to their anarchistic and individualistic meaning, usually associated with these words. And that is a point that is ever present, being spoken by people like Owen Benjamin, who repeats that. And I don't think he's ever read or even heard of Julius Evola before, but he says the exact same things here in maybe 1 in 10 of the streams that he does, because he sees so often this whimpering type of young man that can't really understand women in so many ways. And I don't think he understands just how bad the case is for women of our generation either, but still does put the onus on man to, recapture themselves, put that virility back in themselves, so that women don't put the onus on themselves to have to do what the man should be doing anyways, and so that this natural dichotomy falls back into place.
This means, no succumbing to that desire, that carnal instinct, the feminine nature that can be especially pronounced in modern society, that is encapsulated by modern man. So, in more profane terms, don't be a simp. Don't try to devote yourself to anything beyond other than yourself, and you will attract more women who want to spiritually actualize themselves by adhering to the nature that is disposed within them already. It's funny because Evola talks about the metaphysics of it, but it really is in the basic levels of psychology as well. And in a healthy society, these principles manifest psychologically, and in the same way that you would read, the constellations and the cycles of the sun and all of that as an effect of these metaphysical, things that they represent. The psychology of it is an effect of the metaphysical principle that ordains this psychology to be a thing. So, again, it all comes down to the proper orientation of all principles to their proper archetypes. And that's, I think, the point we need to drive home with a lot of men nowadays, is that the decay that is so often complained about and so very prevalent, seen in the feminine principle or in women in modern society, is in part, if not almost in full, due to the sort of emasculation of men and their rejection of what makes a man absolutely whole and good. And this doesn't mean attributing, or assuming violent tendencies or anything like that to try, or aggressive tendencies, or what may be seen as, stereotypically masculine traits. But in a sense, having that stoic attitude where you are almost above the desires and the instincts of the carnal and animalistic state of the human condition. It's essentially that aristocratic, superior signature look of superiority, or something like that. It's assuming that attitude all the time, not just towards women, but towards everything, and thinking very, I don't want to say logically, because that's so overused in rhetoric, but that's what it is. Essentially thinking very logically about what it is that you want, what it is that you aim to embody, what your aspirations are, and to try to achieve them apart from the feminine principle in itself, because the masculine principle is independent. It is destined to take these roles that the feminine principle is not predisposed for, such as the philosopher king, or the those of the priestly caste, or the intellectuals of this or that traditional lineage, or things like that. And that's not to say that women can't participate in these sporadically, right? You have like your Joan of Arcs and every so often and things like that. But more like generally speaking, these are masculine pursuits, and they need to be fulfilled by men who have the correct disposition and stature about them to not go and fall in lust, as it were, over the first woman who crosses his path, who seems to embody these traits, these necessary traits, even more than he does, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it goes back to that passage I read from Bronze Age Mindset back in the Love in the Kali Yuga episode, with the allegory about the wolf. And that essentially sums up everything that we've been saying right here to close it out. But I think now's a good time to move on to the final chapter, Decline of the Superior Races.
Yes, this is a very short chapter. So the decline of the superior races, or the decline of superior
Fortunately
races.
so.
Yeah.
Because this has been going on for a long time now.
Yeah, it's a very long episode. But I think it's necessary. You know what I mean? So it's...
Absolutely.
So the decline of superior races is essentially the summary of the doctrine of tradition that he outlines, previously in the preceding, 20 chapters. It's very... It's almost conclusive, and it wraps up the last few strings that he leaves untied for the duration of the previous chapters. So he starts off by saying, the modern world is far from being threatened by the danger of underpopulation. The cry of alarm some political leaders have launched in the past with the absurd slogan, there is power in numbers, is totally unfounded. I actually disagree with this, but not for the same... Like, I agree with what he's saying, the semantics that he's saying it with, but let's be honest, there is power in numbers, you know what I mean? So,
yes.
So he says, the truth is that we are facing an opposite danger, the constant and untrammeled increase of population in purely quantitative terms. The deterioration of the population affects only those stocks that should be considered the bearers of the forces that preside over the demos of the world and the masses of the world of the masses, and that contribute to any authentic human greatness. When I criticized the racist worldview, I mentioned that occult power, when present, alive, and at work, constitutes the principle of a superior generation that reacts on the world of quantity by bestowing upon it a form and quality. In this regard, one can say that the superior Western races have been agonizing for many centuries, and that the increasing growth in world population has the same meaning as the swarming of worms on a decomposing organism, as the spreading of cancerous cells. So, basically,
Man,
yeah,
that's
yeah. Like I
a little
said,
spicy.
Like I said, he doesn't pull any punches. You know what I'm saying? So he very much is what he's trying to characterize here by the decline of superior races, and what he uses the word race here for is not just the race of the skin or the race of the body, right? It's also the race that you could characterize caste as race, or you could characterize vocation as race, or you could characterize your lineage as race. There were lots of different races considered in the traditional society that didn't all correspond to, let's say the color of your skin or whatever it's supposed to be attributed to nowadays. So when he says the decline of superior races, he's talking about stocks of human beings that were more in tune with their spirituality and understood things to a higher degree than man is disposed to assume now or even interpret now, because he lacks that intellectual capacity that was possessed by man of higher and more superior races. So this idea actually corresponds to the golden age, the golden race, the iron race, the bronze race, all of that in Greek traditions, or what he characterizes later on as the Hyperboreans, or the those who participated in the golden age spirituality, and their descendants, and how their descendants essentially have involved, not evolved, gone to a involuting process. But one of the things he mentions here is overpopulation, and the fact that there have been so many new people, so many new souls created by this generative principle. And that was one of the things that I've brought up in discussions about this with colleagues and whatnot, is that I almost wonder if the adolescent nature that's typical of the modern individual is because the soul itself is of a newer substance than, let's say, the substance that constitutes the souls of people who are not of that adolescent nature. There's more souls that need to be created, so these souls are newer and more confused and are less in tune with reality than the ones who have been present, for generations.
I have a similar but a bit different of a take to that.
Go ahead.
Maybe it may not be that it's of a newer soul from the ground up, but a newer human soul in the ground, because this explosion of the human race and population over the last 2 centuries or so has pushed beyond the boundaries that historically we had known. And so the natural world has come under threat from this ever-growing expansion and consumption of human avarice as well. And so it may be the spirit of other forms of life that have been reincarnated in a way, or remanifested in this balancing out of the human condition, and have been embodied in the masses that have come anew. Because you can see in individuals like you and I, Vincent, and probably many of the people listening to this show right now, that our souls are of a decidedly older variety, of a more, I don't want to say lived or earthly disposition, but there's a definite difference in quality between our states of being, our minds, our inclinations, than that of the masses. And to kind of translate what Evola was saying here in a mimetic form, like I've been doing throughout the episode, he's essentially saying billions must die in a sort of sense, but only of the case of the masses, that we've overexpanded ourselves beyond a sustainable level, and it's gotten to the point where now we are thinking up ever more elaborate and efficient ways of sustaining this population, not just statically, but in the terms of growth. And then you have contemporary cabals of people like the World Economic Forum and the Bill Gates Foundation or so on and so forth, looking at population reduction, famously the Georgia Guidestones that had just recently been blown up, they called for the same thing to sort of happen, and this reinvigoration of society and rebuilding of civilization after such a collapse of a population. And I think that's kind of taking care of itself just from the modern aversion of having children at all. And that may be by the causes of these World Economic Forum type of people, but it also just may be the process of involution in and of itself, because those same WEF people are of this lower caste that have risen to the top materially to lead the masses in a way, cattle leading cattle in a sort of terms as like Judas goats that are just reinforcing this involutive process, not really realizing that themselves. Or maybe they very well realize it, because some of them may be this, left-hand path type of Kabbalah occult following, and they see this as a sacrificial rite for their own spiritual ascension. Could be either. I don't really know. I just think it's an interesting postulation to put forth as a further explanation of what Evola's getting at here.
I think so as well. And it's funny that you say that, because at the same time that you say that, this population reduction that we're going to be seeing in the coming years, he wasn't seeing, because he had just gotten through the baby boomer era, so it was ever expanding. Now it's kind of like it's peaked and it's met its threshold. But oh, go ahead.
The projections we're seeing nowadays is Africa's going to be 5 times the population of Europe. But thinking about it, Europe as a continent in just landmass on its own is, I think, like 4 times as large as continental Europe, excluding Russia, obviously.
Yeah.
But it makes sense that you could have that much population kind of centered around the African continent. It's just that it's concerning that this, third world boom of population is happening so rapidly, even though historically you forget that the same thing happened with Europe. I don't want to say you, but people making these claims of frantic obsession over things like the race of the blood and so forth, that there's the white genocide and everything going on, which, don't get me wrong, there are attacks on our ethnic historical peoples of Europe. There's no disillusionment there, or not, there's no discredit to that claim there. It's just that you don't really need to worry about it, because we've already gone through our boom and now we're in our bust cycle, and it's going to be other parts of the world that are in their boom and even more quickly going to go in their bust, because these other parts of the world are dependent on European superiority and control for so many aspects, supplying them to have this growth in the first place. And once our bust is sort of completed and we're at our lowest point, everything else is going to fall and crumble just as quickly. And the situation where billions must die is actually going to come true. And even with the WEF types that would like to see that happen with a pure population reduction across the globe, it's not going to be as pretty as they imagine, because they are probably going to get caught up in the same sort of catastrophes that are staring humanity down the line of time. And it's all a matter of this qualitative nature of man, this the superior races, the leaders and heroes that are guiding our age, being ever more pushed out of or dying off from our timeline. And so it's more or less going to be a race of incompetence for the modern world.
Yeah, definitely. But it's funny that you do say that, because he says that thus proliferation is concentrated in the lower social classes and in the inferior races, where the animal-like impulse is stronger than any rational calculation or consideration. So what he's saying is that, the same antinatalist sentiment you'll find in the common caste today, which is what he calls like the inferior races, or all with the animal-like impulse, the masses of people, the uninitiated, common caste. Essentially, these are the people who were in his day reproducing what he says animal-like impulses, But in our day, they have this almost antinatalist child hatred, which is like the complete opposite of what was going on in his day. So I think he didn't see all the way through because, the Industrial Revolution and, all of that, which he lived through the end of, hadn't seen, like, the likes, it hadn't been seen. It was something that the likes of which hadn't been seen throughout the entirety of history. And so that population boom that occurred was a quantitative historic event that he didn't see having any type of significance, or maybe that he saw having too much significance in a sense, metaphysically, where it does have some significance, but it doesn't necessarily mean the end of times. It just means a quantitative bubble of population that is going to die down again. And I don't necessarily know if that was what he had in mind, but it's just interesting to see that it is true that, places like the developing countries are having more kids than, places like America, but the common cast in America is very much oriented towards not having kids, especially people of our generation who are, just coming of age and want to experience, the independency of individuality that they were unable to experience in their teenage years and likely are unable to experience in their 20s just because of financial reasons. But that, again, is another issue in itself because, again, it goes and reaffirms that masculinity being applied to the feminine principle and vice versa, the femininity being applied to the masculine principle.
It is funny because you'd think that Evola would see this as a sort of obvious conclusion to what he just said in the man and woman chapter, because that's essentially what the conclusion of that was, is, this egocentrism and mask of masculinity being put on the feminine ascetic and heroic aspects would lead to this antinatalist type of mentality, because that was the ultimate conclusion, that the logical progression of that these movements. So it's odd that he wouldn't just connect the dots right there, but maybe it was a sense of optimism that women wouldn't just reject,
having children.
Yeah, having children entirely, and that's the biggest factors of it in today's age as well, which I don't know, maybe it was a bout of optimism, a rare bout of optimism, or maybe naivety from Evola. Who's to say? But it's strange that he didn't kind of put that out in his conclusions here either.
I think it might be an inconsideration of something that he didn't know the result of, and so he couldn't say this or that was, that could be true. Not that he didn't predict anything else. He was very thorough with his predictions and saw it coming, but these were things that, were a long time coming, that he could see, hundreds of years of buildup, even when he was born, whereas this antinatalist thing that's occurring now is very, very recent, and I don't think he could have seen it coming, just because of the intensity with which it appeared in such a short amount of time, if that makes sense.
I don't know. Maybe I think he saw it coming, but he didn't get a chance to write it down.
Maybe.
It's very doubtful in my mind that Evola wouldn't have concluded that, seeing everything else that was leading up to it and everything that he could see in real time as well, and then have that extra step to see where it would eventually go.
Yeah. So a few more things that he ties up here. He actually does so. While we were outlining the idea of the feminine inversion of principles in the last chapter, he touches upon it here very briefly. He says, "Phallic man," which is very obviously man who is encapsulated by his lust and primal urges. He says, "Phallic man deceives himself by thinking that he dominates. The truth is that he is passive and always susceptible to the subtler power of women and to the feminine principle. The differentiation of the sexes is authentic and absolute only in the spirit." And he says, "In all superior types of tradition, man has always been considered the bearer of the lineage of the Uranian solar principle. This principle transcends the mere blood principle, which is lost as soon as it converges onto the feminine lineage." So again, he reaffirms that that idea of masculinity needed to be the affirmative aspect, and what happens when man succumbs to his lust is that he becomes this passive, agreeable, unable to essentially identify himself in the face of chasing after his desires. Everything becomes a pursuit, and nothing becomes, nothing remains this stable source that he is supposed to represent, or the stable center that he's supposed to represent. And
a little.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to add that a little earlier on in that same page, it reinforces the point that we were making before. Him saying, after exposing the decadence of modern woman, we must not forget that man is mostly responsible for such a decadence. Just like the plebeian masses would have never been able to make their way into all the domains of social life and civilization if real kings and aristocrats would have been in power, likewise, in a society run by real men, women would have never have yearned for or even been capable of taking the path she is following today, which is what I was saying ending on the last chapter as well, with Owen Benjamin stating those exact same things, and it's Evola restating them here in his conclusions.
Exactly, yeah. And so one other thing that he talks about, he says the symbolical association typical of ancient tradition forms of the male organ with ideas of resurrection, asceticism, and energies that confer the highest powers. As an echo of the superior meanings found even among savage populations, we find expressed in clear terms the idea that only the initiate is a true male, and that initiation marks in an eminent way one's entrance into virility. This means that prior to initiation, the individuals, notwithstanding their physical appearance, have not yet turned into men, and even if they're old enough to, even if they are old, they belong to the same group of children and women, and are deprived of all of the privileges of the clan's virile elites. So that's he has Evola actually talks about this in a book called A Handbook for Right-Wing Youth. And when he talks of the right wing, he doesn't mean the what you would consider right wing today. He talks about, again, this everything oriented towards divinity, spiritual regality, quintessential reality type of stuff. And he orients it towards the right-wing youth because it is purpose for those who are in their essential initiation of into this world of ideas, the world of tradition. And so someone is in their quote-unquote right-wing youth when they are being introduced to right-wing ideas, not ideas of political conservatism, but true traditionalist, capital T, regal ideas. And so it's funny because he orients it towards the youth, but he clarifies that you could be very old and still be in your youth when given when entering into a new vocation. And that's what he's talking about here as well. And then the last thing that I think it's important to consider is a few episodes ago, and this is a point I've been trying to drive home very religiously, pun intended, is the religious entity, or the religious formulation, which is typical of things like Christianity. So the exoteric dogma and the adherence to the religious dogma is an important aspect, I think, for the institutions like a church, for the common cast to adhere to, because they don't understand all of this higher spiritual significance and things like that, which Evola touches upon, and things like that. So the idea for religion, I think, is that the esoteric principle needs to be manifest by the exoteric dogma, of course, and then this exoteric dogma must be adhered to by the masses of the common cast, right? But I also think that this dogma is, in a sense, dissipated in the face of someone who understands the true metaphysical significances behind the dogma. So what he was saying earlier, I forgot that he mentioned this, and so I kind of dinged him on it, but then I didn't realize he mentioned it and rectified it here. But he says, thus even religion could have a place and exercise its function within the whole hierarchy, through subordinated and relative to higher forms of spiritual realization, such as initiation and the various types of higher asceticism. So this is again one of the last points that he touches upon here to wrap this up. But I didn't realize that he had mentioned that, so that was kind of interesting. But he finishes up the chapter by saying, the objects of the considerations I will articulate in the second part of my work is to analyze this process of decadence together with all of those processes that have led to the collapse of the primordial humanity. Yeah, through these, the genesis and the face of the modern world will become manifest. And so that is the line that concludes the first part of this book.
And as typical with us, we constantly get ahead of ourselves in expressing all of the manifestations of the modern world, as Evola was pointing out, going through the traditional aspects of things as we were reading. But don't worry, now we're going to be doing the inverse in calling back to all the traditional aspects of things that we've gone over in the last 21 chapters, as he's reiterating things through the second part of the book.
Exactly. That's actually a very good way of putting it. Through this, we've been, equating these traditional ideas with the modern involutions and inversions of these principles. And now we're going to look at what Evola characterizes as the modern inversions, and then we can see, we can flip back to, earlier chapters and say, this is the principle that should be there. This is the proper principle. But this pretty much ends the doctrine of tradition. What we're going into now is sort of, like I said at the beginning of this video, a historiography of tradition. So the process that tradition took to degenerate and essentially involve, like I said, the antithesis to evolve, it involves through this process. And so I'm very much looking forward to getting into this, because the book takes a different tone now. It reads much less like an analysis of various traditional societies, but now it reads more like a traditional, I don't want to say a story because it's not, but a traditional outline of history through various real or either real historic or pseudo-historic events. And I don't want to say things like, pseudo-historic and say that things like Hyperborea were not real, because given the context in which he's speaking about it, it very much was. But the idea that these things are not recorded in ancient history or are only described to us through myths, this is the fact that makes these things more pseudo-history or mythological history, if you will. But do you have any closing statements before we kind of sign off?
No, I think this is a perfect place to wrap up.
All right, perfect. I would like to thank you guys for your time and for listening into today's podcast. And if you have made it through the video and have enjoyed it, consider giving it a like, as it very much helps out the channel. And if you would like to see more of this content, consider subscribing and clicking the notification bell to see all of our publications as they come out. Thank you once again, Cody.
As always.
And my name is Vincent. I hope to see you back here once again at the Praxis Table Talks.